Part I of The American Far West, 7 Mid-19th Century Views from Abroad. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Wales. The American Far West, 7 Mid-19th Century Views from Abroad by Anonymous. Part I. Far Western Newspapers. There is not a town anywhere in the West of sufficient importance to be reckoned a right smart chance of a city without a local weekly, bi-weekly, or even daily newspaper. As it is impossible for the whole community to be of one mind in matters political, we generally find one devoted to the interests of the Democratic party, and a second to the well-cherished opinions of the Republicans, these two parties dividing social affairs and public and private life in the Far West. Now, what do I mean by the Far West? A term often used, but with a most indefinite application. About New York, the term is applied to the region of which Chicago is the center. If you go to Chicago, you will find that the railway companies are advertising the Far West as Omaha. At Omaha, on the Missouri, Utah seems to be that born, while again at the City of the Saints it is Oregon or California, somewhere about the Pacific at all events. Whether the people of the Pacific Coast have any place where they locate the Far West, it is hard to say. Probably China and Japan would be about the nearest whereabout of that geographically relative locality. The scene of the following sketches will lie, broadly speaking, in the region on either side of the Rocky Mountains, somewhere in the wilds of those new states and territories which are now and again springing up out of the wilderness, which are peopled by an ever-moving and adventurous people, not by any means barbarous, yet far from refined, in fact, of that peculiar type known well enough in those parts of the world as the Western man. It is with the ruder type of newspaper, produced in such out-of-the-way places as lie within the shadow of the Rocky Mountains, the Sierra Nevadas of California, or the Cascade Mountains of Oregon or Idaho, with their characteristics and with their humor, that I propose to deal. The flourishing state of ephemeral literature on the shores of the Pacific, associated as it will ever be in our minds with bowie knives and nuggets, cannot be better expressed than by stating that in the city of San Francisco alone, numbering 150,000 inhabitants, and 19 years ago consisting of only a few cotton tents on some sand hills, there are published no fewer than 45 periodicals, comprising 10 dailies, 8 monthlies, 1 semi-weekly, 1 tri-weekly, and 2 annuals. Of these, 3 are published in the German language, 3 in the Spanish, and 2 in French. The gold of California has attracted men clever in every department of brain and handicraft, and accordingly we find these periodicals edited with good ability and even refinement. It is only when we get up in the interior that we find the Western editor in all his crudity. Suppose that it should ever fall to the lot of a wise man of the East to ride some summer day into one of these quiet little Western towns situated on a prairie or by some river with a not euphonious name, where it is difficult to say when the town commences and the country ends, or which is which, and where the inhabitants, in their dolce far niente longer, seem to wish, like the lotus-eaters, as they tilt their rocking chairs on the shady side of the street in front of the grocery store, that it was always afternoon. Before he has well taken off his jingling Mexican spurs or imbibed a preliminary drink with the landlord of the hotel, he will be accosted by a shabby genteel individual, whom, by the shrewdly telling questions he puts, the traveler will have no difficulty in recognizing as the local editor. If he has not done so already himself, Colonel Homer S. Smith, mine host, will soon take upon himself a Western landlord's privilege of introducing you to Dr., Captain, Judge, or Mr. Ossian E. Dodge, editor of the Swampville Flag of Liberty, and one of our most distinguished citizens, sir. If he be not of the same way of thinking in political matters, it is immaterial, for this civility will only be delayed a few minutes until the opposition editor from across the way makes his appearance in his shirt sleeves to take his meridian cocktail and to squeeze out of the new arrival all the public news he may possess for the public good, in a professional way, or, true to his country, matters of private history for his own private satisfaction. As you get better acquainted with your friend, you will find that he is far from being such a truculent fellow as his leaders and personal items might lead you to suppose. He will hospitably ask you to "come up to my office, Captain, write your letters there, sir," and when you look into his office, which is generally press room, composing room, and study, with little furniture beyond a saliva-rusted stove, a spittoon, and a huge rocking-chair of cheap construction, you will find that it seems to be a general loafing place for the more idle of the citizens of the political opinions which the flag professes. There they are, all smoking, chewing tobacco, eating apples, or ruminating with chair tilted back, or sitting on the step in front of the office door, only occasionally moving over to the neighboring bar-room to put in a blast, or to "hist in a drop of pison." The editor will now and then, if not better employed, rush out to ask a passing acquaintance if he has not such a thing as an item about him, or will bolt round the corner of the street to pump a rusty gold miner who has just now wearily trudged into town for the week's supply of pork and beans. Shortly afterwards you will see the two adjourning to take a drink, or if news from the diggings at Mad Mule Canyon or Shirt Tail Bar well-known mining localities in California, is of a particular spicy character. The miner will adjourn to the office. There his news will be set up in due course, and he will be invited to take a char, doubtless not only in hospitality, but also with eye to the policy of keeping him out of the way of the opposition already on the qui vive. For in these dull, die-away mining or rural villages in some mountain valley of the far West, a man with news is an important personage, and comports himself, most properly, as one from cities. The telegraph and the mail may bring matters of general interest to all alike, but the local items of a difficulty down at Greaser's Camp, or a gold strike in Black Jack's claim at Yuba Dam, are matters which must be picked up by that most industrious individual, the local editor, or, as he is called in other places, reporter. If the paper is going to press, and there is a dearth of items under the column local, there is nothing for it but to extemporize some, or resort to that unfailing remedy of a newsless editor, write letters on local grievances to himself, and answer them in the next issue. In many years' wanderings about the less settled portions of the slopes of the Rocky Mountains, I have had much intercourse, pleasant on the whole, with the Western editor. Scattered through my notebooks are various memoranda illustrative of these rough spurtings of literary effort in a roughly organized state of society. The editor works to please the public, and from the paper can generally be drawn a tolerably fair picture of the community for which it is produced, tinctured, of course, with more or less of the individual peculiarities of the presiding spirit. I must in honesty explain that no one need expect in a few glances over a single file of Western newspapers to find so many strongly marked characteristics as occur, within narrow limits, in a gathering like mine. For that contains picked specimens culled at wide intervals. On the other hand, I can assert that as they were not gathered with any special object in view, they are fairly representative, and in no case is there the slightest exaggeration. The editor himself has generally been brought up as a printer, and not unfrequently, in case of accident, will set up and work off his own leader. Not unfrequently he puts in his time at case, and if he be of a speculative turn of mind, drives the stage-coach or runs the hotel. But oftener he is a local attorney, filling up his spare time with politics, and possibly sits in the territorial legislature. There is not, I believe, a politician of any eminence in this wise who at one time or other has not been a printer or a lawyer; the former generally graduating into the latter, as the world deals more kindly with him or ambition pricks him on. He very seldom sticks to the editorial desk, but gravitates with Western versatility into some other more lucrative line of business. If he be sufficiently talkative, he takes to politics, and "runs" for the local legislature or the district judgeship; or if muscularly inclined, you will find him working in a mining claim, or engaged in fulfilling a contract to blaze a trail. The first thing which attracts attention in the little dirty-looking, ill-printed sheet is its astounding personality. That personality being generally not so much directed against the other party, or even against the rival paper as representing the other party, as against the editor of it in his private capacity. Every Western editor's name is prominently printed at the head of his paper, and instead of talking as he of the Eatanswill Gazette might of our contemptible contemporary, the Journal, the Western paper talks of "that low-lived hound, Cephas E. Slocum, who edits the miserable two-bit thing over the way." Footnote: 1 bit, 5d. to 7d., and 2 bits, 1 shilling, being about the ordinary price of a single newspaper to the west of the Rocky Mountains. The former is the lowest coin in general circulation. However, if taken by the week, the usual subscription for a daily paper is only 1 shilling, delivered. The editor of a San Jose paper quarrels with another editor. Listen to his description of his friend's character. "He is a professional loafer, and may generally be seen round drinking saloons, not only at election times, but for years after. He makes a game of politics, and plays as he would a game of short cards or cut-throat monte to win. He wears his hair short, a style known as the fighting cut, that he may be always ready for a scrimmage, and that his adversary may take no undue advantage. The preponderance of his brains is located between his ears. His countenance is concave, and one or both his eyes are usually in mourning from the effects of his last fight. He is powerful in primaries, where he votes early and often for his favorite candidates, succeeds, and calls the nomination regular. In the matter of piety, long prayers, &c., that is entirely out of his line. Cursing is more especially his forte. He can tell the difference between a whiskey straight and a gin cocktail with his eyes shut, and can snuff a treat 2 blocks off. He spends his money with —, and makes it a point of honor never to pay an honest debt. He accepts office for the sake of the stealings, and is loyal because it pays best." There is no joke here. The man is perfectly in earnest, as none who knew the pair of worthies would for a moment doubt. Nothing can more thoroughly express his personality, as well as the absolute dearth of local news in a mountain newspaper in Nevada, than the following from the Virginia Enterprise. "We observe that Breyer, local of the news," i.e., local editor or reporter, "has on a new coat. If we remember right, there was a dry goods store burnt out a short time ago, and that a number of coats which were put on the street for safe keeping, after having been saved from the fire, were missing. Of course, we don't intend to cast any reflection, or to say that Breyer nipped any of them. Oh, no." Another indignantly states that it would take the auger of common sense longer to pierce into a certain editor's brain than it would take for a boiled carrot to bore through the Alps. After this elegant burst of eloquence, we may be prepared to learn that William T. Dowdall, an Illinois editor, having read Brick Pomeroy out of the Democratic party, the latter replies by calling Dowdall an idiotic, swill-headed chunk. Whereupon Dowdall calls Brick a pandemoniac, paste-pot cutthroat. The editor of the Oakland News offers a handsome apology to the editor of his San Leandro contemporary for a typographical error in calling him a monkey. He meant a donkey. Sometimes these personal pen battles are a little more truculent. There is a well-known editor out West of the name of Prentice. Prentice is never known to be put out, and accordingly Mr. Smith, we shall call him, of the Cleveland Plain Dealer, made a fatal mistake when he penned the following: "Prentice is a liar, and we shall tell him so when we meet him." Prentice thus replies in his next paper: "Ah, will you, Mr. Smith? About that time there will be a funeral, and the Smith family will be the principal mourners." The following is more in the highly jocose way, and coming from a village in the vicinity of San Francisco, is characteristic enough: "Wanted, a calaboose." Jail. McKillen, of the Parajo Times, is earnestly petitioning the Board of Supervisors for a calaboose, which institution, he argues, is sadly wanted in the town of Watsonville. We once spent a week in Watsonville, and we have no hesitation in saying that McQuillan's head is quite level on the calaboose question. A calaboose is sadly needed in that locality. So says the Dramatic Chronicle, to which the editor pointedly referred to as McQuillan replies in parenthesis at the end of a reprint: "Yes, we remember your visit here, which suggested to us the necessity of a calaboose." My friend, the Hon. W. P. H., is well known in Northwest America as the active superintendent of Indian affairs in Oregon, and was at one time editor, and is still proprietor, of the Oregon Statesman. On one of his tours he captured the wives of the great war chief Panin of the Shoshones, who had for 8 years waged continual war against the whites, accompanied with most merciless outrages. These women were held as hostages, and the result was that in the ensuing summer the chief sued for peace, and Mr. H., with the officers of the Indian Department and a party of friends, of which the writer of these pages formed one, journeyed along the region of the Snake River to deliver them up in state. Our astonishment was great to find our doings subsequently recorded in the opposition paper as follows: "Bill H., editor of the Statesman, went up Snake River last week with 3 squaws," the notion evidently being to lead those at a distance who did not know the official character of the journey to suppose that Bill H. was a person of very immoral life, who consorted in trigamic concubinage with aboriginal ladies, and that the Statesman must be a vile paper to have such an editor. Some years ago I passed an evening at the Dalles of the Columbia River, a locality well known to all readers of early adventure beyond the Rocky Mountains. It is now a little village — city, of course, they call it — on the highway to the mines of Idaho. It was crowded on this particular night with travelers. Among the motley throng were various newspaper men bound to the mines, either to canvass for their papers, correspond, or generally to look around. Among others I was introduced to an exceedingly pleasant gentleman called Mr. Samuel Bowers, editor of a Portland paper. He was an excellent fellow, affable and pleasant, and after the manners and customs of the country we had many drinks together. I believe we engaged to correspond. What was my delight when the Dalles Mountaineer, the weekly paper, came out next morning to find the following anent my friend of the evening before, who was now on his way up the Columbia River: "Miners, look out! Among other rogues, thieves, cutthroats, rowdies, and blackguards generally, whom we noticed in the city last night, was Sam Bowers, who has figured in the role of newspaper editor, school fund thief, etc. We believe that he is on his way to the mines, in which case the honest miners had better look sharp, else Sam will bilk them sure." I expressed a little surprise to the friend who had introduced me. "Oh," was the reply, "that's nothing. Sam perhaps ain't much on the prey, but still he's not such a bad coon, but he differs in politics with the folks in this quarter. Watch the Umatilla and other up-river papers and see what they say." I did watch them, with this result, that the paper in the next village on the river above the Dalles, after a fashion very common in the Western newspapers, I suppose for the sake of filling up, copied out the item with the commentary: "Sam passed through here the other day. Nothing missing." To which the next weekly adds, Sam passed through here on Thursday, but as far as we can learn, without injury to the portable property of any of our citizens. There was talk about a child's rattle and a red-hot stove, but we believe the rumor was without foundation. So another editor apologizes to another for calling him a miserable thing. He meant a nothing. And the editor of the Solano Press calls his brother of the Herald an absurd ass, a contemptible cur, a dirty dog, and a liar. Equally parliamentary is the language of the Oregon Statesman in reference to a contemporary. We republish today a vile, degraded, infamous, and execrably atrocious lie from the columns of the Daily Oregonian. Next week, when time and space will permit, we shall reply to it. For the present, suffice it for the low, vulgar, foul-mouthed, and unrefined hound to know that our eye is upon him, and he cannot escape us. The Solano Press is apparently of a fierce nostril and anxious for a fight. Woe betide the unfortunate wight who differs with it in opinion, even though the opinion be not political, but on the serious business of the best route to a certain mining locality. I remember a newspaper correspondent, as harmless a man as need be, I well know, who ventured to hint that there was a better route to the Idaho mines than by passing up the Columbia. His advice, if followed, would be to the detriment of the Columbia River towns. With what unanimity was he abused! No attempt was made at argument. It was the old endorsement of the brief, no defense, abuse, plaintiff's attorney. The Oregonian suggested that some charitable packer (muleteer who packs or carries goods to the mines or elsewhere) some charitable packer had given him the privilege of riding the bell mare, and had generously offered him a blanket to cover his miserable carcass. The last I heard of this unfortunate young man was the suggestion of the Umatilla Tri-Weekly Advertiser that the flunkey must have lingered along the road scouring knives and washing dishes. That he never paid for a meal is evident from his statement of the prices charged, etc., etc. Here below is a piece of fine writing from an editorial in a Californian mining paper. Let vagabonds howl and traitors hiss. Let the breeders of bloodhounds to track and tear Union refugees bay like their own dogs. Let the smitten maniacs who cursed Johnson till he turned traitor also vomit new blasphemies against the holy name of liberty. Let foul lust and lazy pride and insolent and testy spleen and self-conscious envy and gleaming hate and blear-eyed prejudice and besotted ignorance and porcine brutality stir every cesspool with their asinine vociferations until every clubroom of democracy reeks like an omnium gatherum of stenches. I regret to say that many of these gems of far western periodical literature are occasionally not only scurrilous on the individual attacked, but verge on the sacred precincts of the family circle, holding up to public scorn the foibles and weaknesses of the female members of the family of the individual attacked, and even occasionally being so openly coarse and indecent as to preclude their being noticed in this place. Probably no one likes, when running for the honorable office of Congressman or Supreme State Judge, to have it shown in a newspaper how, in an early portion of his career, he murdered his grandmother and ignominiously buried her in the back kitchen. Mr. Artemus Ward, himself a quondam newspaper man, has exactly struck this nail on the head when he represents in the controversy about a plank road this attack upon the editor of the Eagle of Freedom. The passage is worth quoting as an epitome of a system. Quote, "The road may be, as our contemporary says, a humbug, but our aunt isn't bald-headed, and we haven't got a one-eyed sister Sal. Wonder if the editor of the Eagle of Freedom sees it. This used up the Eagle of Freedom feller because his aunt's head does present a skinned appearance, and his sister Sarah is very much one-eyed. We have recently put up in our office an entirely new sink, of unique construction, with 2 holes through which the soiled water may pass to the new bucket underneath. What will the hell hounds of the advertiser say to this? We shall continue to make improvements as fast as our rapidly increasing business may warrant. Wonder whether a certain editor's wife thinks she can palm off a brass watch chain on the community for a gold one." A paper in Vancouver Island used to style its evening contemporary the Night Cart. Though a vast portion of a Western newspaper might without a very great stretch of adverse criticism be styled personal, yet by emphasis in the local item column you can see every now and then paragraphs entitled personal. These paragraphs refer to the business of private individuals in contradistinction to others relating to the public weal. What they are may be judged by the following personal welcoming home of a prominent citizen. "Mr. Joe Tritch arrived home last night with the stage. He has on a new suit of state clothes, including a fine plug hat. He looks the doggonedest cuss ever since Jim Ford left, but nevertheless we are glad to see him, and hope he will settle down and behave himself." The following is peculiarly national in its curiosity. "Nathan E. Wallace and Charlie Henry went up to Fort Langley last night. Business unknown." As might be expected, such personalities occasionally lead to hostile encounters between rival editors and their readers. Most frequently these consist only in a thrashing on either side, and I fancy very few Western editors have missed having a difficulty of that sort at one time or another on their hands. I possess a scrap book kept by Mr. B. Griffin of Victoria in the earlier years of California, and such items as the following are not unfrequent: "Collision between H. A. de Courcy, Esquire, editor of the Calaveras Chronicle, and Mr. W. H. Carter." "Affair of honor between W. H. Jones and Seleucus T. Slingsby." "Editorial difficulty down at Santa Clara. Man shot," etc. John King, of William, editor of the San Francisco Herald, was shot by a rowdy whom he had attacked in his paper. His death may be said to have been the origin of the Vigilance Committee, which, with a lawless justice, created comparative peace and order where anarchy and villainy had reigned. I heard a story about a new editor who had come to a place which was infested with a gang of ruffians. Before his face was generally known, he attacked those men most violently in his paper. One day, as he was sitting in his office after having published a particularly severe article, a stalwart individual, brandishing a whip in his hand, rushed in and inquired for the editor. Suspecting evil, he asked the visitor to be seated and he would call the editor, who had just stepped out for a minute. On his way downstairs he met a second individual carrying a bludgeon and likewise inquiring vigorously for the editor. "Oh, sir, he is sitting in his office upstairs. You'll find him there." When he next peeped into the office, the two were belaboring each other thoroughly, rolling over and over, and each fancying that he had the editor in hand. I tell the story for what it is worth, and do not pretend to guarantee its exact truth. Doolittle, a Southern editor, held his post for 6 months, and in that time was stabbed twice, shot 3 times, belabored with a bludgeon once, thrown into a pond once, but was never kicked. During his 6 months' experience he killed 2 of his adversaries. All these are absolute facts. When Isaac Disraeli wrote the quarrels and calamities of authors, he must assuredly have known nothing of Western newspaper life, otherwise a chapter ought to have been added to both books. As a set-off, the local of the Memphis Bulletin jestingly sums up his year's experience as follows: Been asked to drink, 11,393. Drank, 11,392. Requested to retract, 416. Didn't retract, 416. Invited to parties, receptions, presentations, etc. by people fishing for puffs, 3,333. Took the hint, 33. Didn't take the hint, 3,300. Threatened to be whipped, 174. Been whipped, 0. Didn't come to time, 170. Been promised bottles of champagne, whiskey, brandy, gin, bitters, etc., if I would go after them, 3,650. Been after them, 0. Going again, 0. Been asked, "What's the news?" 300,000. Told, 13. Didn't know, 200,000. Lied about it, 90,987. Been to church, 2. Changed politics, 32. Expected to change still, 33. Gave for charity, $5. Gave for a terrier dog, $23. Cash on hand, 0. Everybody advertises in the West, professional men as well as tradesmen, and it is mainly owing to this extensive advertising business that so many of the local newspapers subsist. It is always expected that the editor should call attention in the body of the paper to the advertisement when first inserted, and accordingly you continually see such notices as the following: We call our readers' attention to the auction of boots and shoes by our fellow citizen, Washington Hubbs, which appears in our advertising columns this day. Wash is pretty tonguey and generally persuades folks to buy. Or, our readers will observe that Messrs. Caleb Johnston and Company have opened a restaurant on the corner of Jackson and Fremont Street. Footnote: In Sacramento the streets are named A to B, and first, second, third, and so on. Monotonous, no doubt, but still a relief to the everlasting Washington, Jackson, Fremont, Kearny, etc. streets. End note. On the corner of Jackson and Fremont Street, where the tallest sort of feeding may be had at all hours at the lowest possible cost to the spondulics money. We advise our friends to give Caleb a call. Advertisements of hotels with an initial letter of a Noah's Ark-like house, or of mule and horse dealers and hirers, figure extensively. What would the London Times say to the following, which I cut from the Idaho Statesman? Footnote: June 13, 1865. The advertiser is apparently aggrieved on the head of some rivals running an unfair competition with him. Quote, "Opposition is the life of business. Work for nothing and find yourself, Mr. R., and I am with you, and you damned old rascal. Here we go. Horses kept to hay per night, $1. Saddle horses per day, $1. 2 horses for buggy per day, $2.50. Oats per pound, 5. Call any time, day or night. A new era. Wool mattresses in Grand Ronde Valley, Oregon. Prices reduced. The cheapest house in the burg. All the creature comforts to be had at our house as they can be had anywhere on the sunny side of the Blue Mountains. Are you hungry? Come to our house. Are you thirsty? Take a drink. Are you weary? Try one of my mattresses. Are you sad? I will condole with you. Are you glad? I will rejoice with you. If you are mad, I will go out and spar with you. Come and see me." End quote. Outside hotel keepers are every now and then calling the miners' attentions to their square meals, by which is meant full meals, in contradistinction to the imperfect dinner a man has to put up with on the mountains. Men who wish to buy timber are referred to this solemn announcement of the fact of some timber being for sale. Quote, "Grand benefit of Salem, Marion County, Oregon. From and after this date, we propose to sell lumber, laths, and slabs as cheap as any other high-toned mill in the country. Times are changed, and we have changed the credit of 1 year and returned to ready pay, without which no webfoot need apply." Footnote: Webfoot, a slang phrase after an inhabitant of the rainy valley of the Willamette. End footnote. Bookkeeping is most effectually played out. You that owe, come to our office. There's the place, and settle now. We cannot afford to wait, and when we commence to done, we never get done. Be wise to-day, 'tis folly to delay. End quote. Queer people follow all sorts of queer businesses out West. A classical scholar was keeping a hotel in Victoria, Vancouver Island, as might be inferred from his advertisements, which used to be interlarded with Greek and Latin quotations from Aeschylus, Plato, Horace, Oppian, and Ovid. Sometimes the newspapers contain an ominous warning from the city marshal to certain suspicious characters to "get up and dust." or an announcement of some indignant individual who has been paid in greenbacks instead of gold, as is customary all over the Pacific still, notwithstanding the depreciated currency, with the heading, "Spot him, spot him, spot him." The following melancholy advertisement is culled from an Oregon paper. "Will the gentleman who stole my melons on last Sabbath night be generous enough to return me a few of the seeds, as they were a very rare variety?" Marriages are expected to be, or at least are, accompanied with some guerdon to the printers. At the end of these announcements you generally see something like the following: "Our staff returns thanks for their present and drank the happy couple's health in flowing bumpers of champagne." The present consists almost always of a few bottles of champagne, as no charge is made for such announcements in the local papers. Typographical errors are always troublesome, and a Western paper is usually distinguished for their number and variety. Occasionally these errors become matter of considerable difficulty to the editor, and add one more responsibility to many others. For instance, a friend of mine got into a little trouble that way. In a weak moment he agreed to conduct the weekly paper in a mining village for the editor, who was called off on other business. All went well until a leading man among the miners brought in an obituary of his deceased wife, who was about the only white woman in the village. Now, as items are scarce, it was sent straight to the printer. On revising the proof, my friend found that it read, "She was distinguished for her virtue and benevolence." He concluded that the husband must have meant virtues. A proof was accordingly dispatched to the husband with a request to correct it and send it to the printer. My friend went to bed. Early next morning he was roused by an acquaintance with a paper in his hand, informing him that Jim So-and-so, the author of the obituary aforesaid, was hunting him, i.e. the editor, all over town. Now, as hunting a man means in the West going through all the drinking shops with a huge revolver in hand, shouting, "Where is he?" my friend had just reason for alarm, and inquired what in the world he was being hunted for. "Oh," was the reply, "fun is all right, but you know that item about old Mother was a little too much. She mightn't be just the correct thing, but still Jim thought a sight of her." It was some time before the temporary editor could understand what was meant, until the paper was shown him with the obituary intimating that Mrs. was distinguished for her virtue, ? and her benevolence. The husband knew nothing about a proof, and the printer had treated the query as an editor's correction. After considerable difficulty the indignant husband was consoled, and peace was made over drinks in the nearest saloon. Errors of context are not unfrequent. Thus, the San Diego paper announces that the schooner General Harney had just arrived in the harbor, with no passengers but Nathan Brown, who owns half the cargo, and the captain's wife. Or that there was lost "a valuable new silk umbrella belonging to a gentleman with a curiously carved head." Sometimes the make-up of the paper is a little out of joint. Thus it was rather a mistake, savoring of grim humor, to put the arrangements for a police commissioner's funeral under the head of "Rural Sports." Paying in advance is always one of the cardinal virtues in the subscriber to any periodical, but perhaps the pious editor of the Christian Index need not have announced so prominently that "but a week since we recognized the death of an old father in the church, a careful reader of the Index, and who paid for 3 papers in advance." In a country where every year thousands of immigrants from the southwestern states arrive over the plains and the Rocky Mountains, full of stories of Indian fights and chock full of alkali, a good itemizer of such matters is important. Accordingly, we find announced that "we have engaged the services of an immigrant editor, to whom is entrusted all matters connected with Injuns, fights, and alkalied subjects." Utah editors notwithstanding, the presence of the saints are rather profane fellows. One of them heads his leader with the startling title of "Hell Boiling Again." English newspaper readers would be rather surprised to find some morning their favorite organ printed on brown packing paper, by reason of the office having run short of the usual paper. I have seen this more than once in Vancouver Island. Again, the Chronicle, a paper published in the same English colony off the northwest coast of America, worth stating as its whereabouts seems only to be known to a few F.R.G.'s, announces in a paper before me that, owing to the market being bare of paper of the usual size, we shall be compelled to appear in a reduced form until the arrival of the mail steamer Active with a supply. Again, the same paper, on one occasion, appeared with one side blank, accompanied by an explanatory note that, owing to an accident, the composed matter got disarranged, and as there was no more time to set it up again, our readers will please excuse the blank page. Letters to the paper are not addressed as in England to the editor of , but Editors, Stump City Gazette, and commencing Messrs. Editors. Some of these papers are edited by women, and in the controversy about women's rights it is worthy of remark that the feminine editorials are not the least truculent of the literary efforts, especially in times of political contest, when one of the sterner sex ventures to raise the lady's virtuous indignation. A female editor announces that, being a woman, she cannot take satisfaction of the low-lived hound who wrote the article in our Contemporary over the way, but she has a little boy who will clean him out handsomely in about 2 minutes. Generally, just before an election contest, fresh papers are started to advocate particular views, and it is then that the Western paper is seen in all its glory. It is rampant and scatters slaughter on every side. On the whole, I think that the most objectionable feature I observed in the Western newspaper system is the custom of "dead-heading," that is, of the editors going free on railways, steamers, stages, and even paying their hotel bill and livery stable keeper by praising "the gentlemanly and high-toned proprietor." I know that many papers will not permit of this system. The New York Legislature passed an act for abolishing and forbidding the deadhead system as far as possible. Taking them all in all, though the Western papers may be rough in their language, yet with rare exceptions they are always decent. They may be rude in their humor, but their rudeness differs as much from the double entendre of the low class of city papers as much as the honest clay of their own prairie lands differs from the slime of the street. On the whole, they work for good, and if their literature be not very refined, neither are their readers. So if it do not civilize them, neither does it suffer them to remain barbarous, as they would be very apt to be in the rude society of the remote far western glens. End of Part 1. Part 2 of The American Far West, 7 Mid-19th Century Views from Abroad, by Anonymous. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 2, Far Western Judges and Juries. In the United States, and indeed also in Canada, there is no distinction between barrister and attorney, and in the newer settlements to become either requires little study. It used to be said that in some parts of Oregon all a man had to do to be admitted an attorney was to go round for some time with a law book under his arm and talk "constitution" in front of grocery doors. A gentleman of Oregon gave me a copy of a legal document preserved in the archives of Marion County, Oregon, and written by an attorney (I knew the man) regularly licensed to practice. It is a demurrer to a complaint in an action in which Marion County is the plaintiff and one G.B. Wagnon defendant, brought for the recovery of a fine for violating a statute in the disposition of stray animals. Part of it runs precisely thus: "And now comes G.B. Wagnon, the defendant, in the Bove suit or cause, and files a demoirer, and says that the plaintiff should not have nor maintain his action against said defendant for the following says there is not that plain and concise statement of the facts constituting the cause of action, as there is no description of collier marks, nor brands, nor by whom sprayed, and further says that he was not served with a certified copy of said complaint. Therefore the defendant prays this honorable court to dismiss the above suit this 18th day of December, 1859." Another attorney delivered a famous defense of a man who was caught in the act of stealing a hank of cotton yarn. It ran something like this, "Gentlemen of the jury, do you think my client Thomas Flynn, off Muddy Creek and the Big Willamette, would be guilty of stealing a hank of cotton yarn? Gentlemen of the jury, I reckon not, I s'pose not. By no manner of means, gentlemen, not at all. He are not guilty. Tom Flynn? Good heavens! Gentlemen, you all know Tom Flynn, and an honor now, gentlemen, do you think he'd do it? No, gentlemen, I s'pose not, I reckon not. Thomas Flynn? Why," warming up with virtuous indignation, "why, great snakes and alligator, Tom's a whole team on Muddy Creek, and a hoss to let," and insinuatingly, "do you think he'd sneak off with a miserable hank of cotton yarn? Well, gentlemen, I reckon not, I s'pose not. When the wolves was a-howling, gentlemen, on the mountings of Oregon, and the milishing was a-fighting of the Indians on Rogue River, do you think, gentlemen, my client, Thomas Flynn, Esquire, could be guilty of hookin', yes, hookin', gentlemen, that pitiful, low, mean hank of cotton yarn? Onpossible! Gentlemen, I reckon I know my client, Mr. Thomas Flynn. He's got the fastest nag and the purtiest sister, gentlemen, in all Muddy Creek and the Big Willamette. That, gentlemen, are a fact. Yes, gentlemen, that are a fact. You can just bet on that, gentlemen. Yes, gentlemen, you can just bet your bones on that. Now, 'pon honor, gentlemen, do you think he are guilty? Gentlemen, I reckon I s'pose not. Why, gentlemen," indignantly beginning to believe it himself, "my client, Mr. Thomas Flynn, am no more guilty of stealing that 'ere hunk of cotton yarn than a toad has got a tail. Yes, a tail, gentlemen, than a toad has got a tail." Verdict for defendant, case dismissed, and court adjourned to whiskey up at the late prisoner's expense. Little as such law may be worth, it is surprising with what alacrity a young community of miners or backwoodsmen will attempt to form some organization for the preservation of order according to law, and how naturally they proceed to elect a magistrate or judge out of their number. This desire proceeds in part from a wish to preserve order, and in part from the all-engrossing passion for voting, holding conventions and caucuses, and electing somebody to hold some office or other, with the usual amount of speechifying and drinking. An old gentleman with whom I passed many pleasant evenings on the walls of Panama in days gone by, described to me his recollection of a court-room in a Western state. It was a rough log building with a bar of unhewn timber stretched across it. This was the bar of justice. Behind it was a table with a jar of molasses, a bottle of vinegar, and a jug of water to make switchel for the court. Time 10 a.m. Enters sheriff. Judge, who is paring his corns after the manner of the venerable Judge McAlmond of San Francisco, who was in the habit of paring his corns while the business of the court was going on, and generally sat with his heels tilted up in front of him. "Wal, Mr. Sheriff, do you think we'll get a jury to-day?" "Nah, Judge, jurymen are rather scarce to-day, but I got 11 men corralled under a black walnut tree outside, and my niggers are hunting down a 12th. I reckon we'll have a jury in about half an hour." And so the sheriff proceeds to liquor, and the judge continue paring his corns until the court opens. I was assured by a former chief justice of one of the states on the western slope of the Rocky Mountains that the first grand jury he ever charged were sitting on the prairie under a tree, and there was not a man of them that had on any other foot gear but moccasins. and I know a judge who, in the earlier days of California, when everybody was bound to make money, sat on the bench in the morning, mined during the day, and played the fiddle in a whiskey shop at night. The county judge of Madison County, in Washington Territory, does, or did, run the gang saw in the Port Madison mills. In these judges we often find the notion of law not very defined, though, which is more important, that of equity is strong. A most notorious rowdy from New England, who had escaped the law several times, was at last captured in the act of smashing the interior of a Chinese house of ill fame in the little village of Eureka in northern California. Evidence against him was rather weak, and it was feared he would again escape. But when the prisoner was brought into court, his Honor burst upon him with a tirade of abuse. You long-leathered, lantern-jawed Yankee cuss, we've ketched ye, at last. I'll commit him at once." "But, Judge," whispered the clerk, "you'll have to hear the evidence." "Evidence be blowed," was the rejoinder. "Wasn't I thar, and seed it all myself?" Judge P. was holding a term of the district court in the village of Corvallis, in the then Territory of Oregon. His court was held in a common log house, with a large open fireplace and a few rough, heavy benches that had never known plane. An indictment was found against one Charlie Sanborn for selling whiskey at retail, although he had no license. He stood at one side of the fireplace with his hands deep in his pockets. The judge sat upon the end of a school bench on the other side of the fire. When required to plead guilty or not guilty, Charlie threw himself on the mercy of the court. The judge then sentenced him to pay the lowest fine and costs. At the close of the sentence, by way of personal palliation, his lordship remarked that while it was the duty of the court to enforce the laws as it found them on the statute book, the person of the court was not inimical to men who sold whiskey. There is in Idaho Territory a judge who is well known as Alec Smith. A woman brought suit in his court for divorce, and had the discernment to select a particular friend of her own, who stood well with the judge, as her attorney. One morning the judge called up the case, and, addressing himself to the attorney for the complainant, said, "Mr. H., I don't think people ought to be compelled to live together where they don't want to, and I will decree a divorce in this case." Mr. H. bowed blandly. Thereupon the judge, turning to another attorney, whom he took to be the counsel for the defendant, said, "Mr. M., I suppose you have no objection to the decree?" Mr. M. nodded assent. But the attorney for the defendant was another Mr. M., not then in court. Presently he came in, and finding that his client had been divorced without a hearing, began to remonstrate. Alec listened a moment, then interrupted, saying, "Mr. M., it is too late. The court has pronounced the decree of divorce, and the parties are no longer man and wife. But if you want to argue the case right bad, the court can marry them over again and give you a crack at it." I was at Clear Lake when an Irishman named Jerry McCarthy was tried in the county court on a charge of whipping his wife. A point of law was raised by the attorney for the defense as to the admissibility of certain evidence offered by the district attorney. Judge J. H. Thompson, for it is judge, once judge, always, and the court called upon the attorney to produce his authorities to sustain his position. The attorney being rather slow in finding the law in point, the court, just as he had found it and was rising to read it, ruled that the evidence was not admissible. "The deuce you do!" hallooed the district attorney. "Say, Judge, I read you the law and bet you $1,000 I'm right." "I'll send you to jail for 24 hours for contempt of court," cried the judge. "Send to jail and be hanged," cried the district attorney. "I know my rights and intend to maintain them." The judge then called out, "Sheriff Crigler, Crigler Sheriff, take Judge Thompson to jail and adjourn court 24 hours." Crigler advanced to obey the order, but halted upon seeing the district attorney put himself into a "posish," at the same time shouting, loud enough to be heard all over the town, that neither Crigler nor any other man should carry him to jail. To make things sure, the sheriff called for a commitment, but while this was being prepared, mutual apologies passed between the court and the district attorney, and the order was revoked. The court was then adjourned for a quarter of an hour to allow, according to custom made and provided in such cases, of drinks being exchanged, after which the trial proceeded to its result in the acquittal of the defendant. If all stories be true, occasionally the court adjourns in less favored districts to allow antagonistic attorneys to fight out with their fists what couldn't be settled by their tongues. I witnessed once, not in a rough American territory, but in the British town of Victoria, Vancouver Island, a stand-up fight between the Honourable the Attorney General and a client of the opposite party in a suit, and not long afterwards two of the most prominent of the members of the Colonial Parliament engaged in a like encounter. I mention this lest it might be unjustly supposed that these eccentricities are found exclusively in border parts of the United States. One summer afternoon I happened to pass through a frontier village in by no means the newest state of the Pacific settlements. While my horse was baiting, hearing that the Supreme Court was in session, I strolled in. After passing up a rickety chair, thickly sprinkled with saliva, cigar ends, and sawdust, where the rough unplaned board walls were scrawled over with likenesses of Judge this and Judge that, and remarks upon them personally, politically, and judicially, I entered by a rickety old door a plastered room with a whitewashed board ceiling, but very dirty, and a floor covered with sawdust. On a few forms scattered through the room lolled some citizens, half asleep. They turned round at the sound of my jingling Mexican spurs, but finding that I was only a rough fellow with a buckskin shirt on, lolled back again and dozed off to sleep, until aroused by some particular burst of eloquence from the lips of a linen-coated lawyer who was speaking furiously on the jumping of a mining claim. When anything particular seized the fancy of the citizens, they would applaud in a lazy manner, and once or twice an enthusiastic miner in gum boots, with his cheek distended by an enormous chaw of tobacco, shouted, "Bully! Good again!" and "That's so, Judge!" But he was, I am glad to say, instantly quashed, though only partially put down, for he would still breathe out, in a lower tone, "Bullee! Good on your head!" and so on, and explain to me, in a stage whisper, the peculiar merits of the case, in which it would seem he was interested. For he was the only person present who cared anything about the proceedings. Except the lawyer's voice and the whispering of his excited client, there was no noise in the court but the fall of a disused quid or the squirting of tobacco juice. The lawyers sat at a horseshoe table at one end of the room, most of them sound asleep, with their chairs tilted back and their heels on the table before them. In front of them, on a raised platform, sat a gentleman without a waistcoat, but with a long and rather dusty brown linen coat over a somewhat dirty white shirt without a collar. He, too, had his legs up in front of him, and was likewise chewing tobacco with a slow motion of his leathery jaws. For the heat of the day and the somniferous character of the proceedings seemed to have disposed him to sleep, like everybody else. Now and then he would incline his head, but only to squirt the rejected juice between his legs. Sometimes, when the lawyer indulged in unbecoming language in reference to the court, he would start up, and in the excitement of the moment miss his aim, and squirt over among the sleepy counsel. Finally, he had to charge the jury, which he did in a very sensible and thoroughly legal manner. He was a good lawyer, and had been attentive to the case. However, in my eyes, it detracted a little from his honour's dignity to see him take the half-used quid from his mouth and hold it between his thumb and forefinger while he charged. In the course of the evening I had a chance of making very close acquaintance with his honour. The little village hotel was crowded with an unwonted concourse of lawyers and jurymen, and when I made up my mind to stay over the night, the proprietor (there are no landlords in America) informed me that he reckoned Judge had the only single bed, and if I liked to put in with him I could get to stay somehow. Not wishing to inconvenience His Honor, I preferred to pass the night in my own blanket on the stoop or porch of the building. I have seen a judge who is said, in pursuance of his duty as a magistrate, to have fined a man $25 for shooting at another, but who also, swayed by his feelings as a man, mulcted the other in the same figure for not shooting back again. At the Caribou Gold Mines in British Columbia lives a well-known Irish gold commissioner whose common-sense decisions have gained great reputation throughout that section of country. On one occasion, two mining companies came before him with some dispute. One swore one way and the other swore the exactly opposite way. The judge was nonplussed. "Look here, boys," at last was his sage decision, "there's no use you going to law about it. There's some hard swearing somewhere. Where, I won't pretend to say. You say this, and they say that. Aye, and produce witnesses, too. What am I to do? Of course, if you insist, I'll come to a decision, but I honestly confess it will be only a toss-up. I tell you what's the best thing to do. You know my shanty down the creek?" All shouted in the affirmative. "Well, in that shanty there's a bottle of prime whiskey, in which I will be happy to drink luck to both of you. Now, the first man there gets the suit. Go." Out of the court they rushed, down the creek, over logs, and over mining flumes, tumbling and rolling and running, with half the population after them, until they reached the cabin in question. When the judge arrived shortly afterwards, he found a stalwart miner firmly grasping the handle of the door. The whiskey was produced, luck was drunk, and everybody went away perfectly satisfied with the decision. Most commendable, on the whole, is the patience evinced by these judges under the orations of long-winded and not very learned attorneys. The most extraordinary instance of patience was that of a judge in Illinois, who, after two wordy lawyers had argued and re-argued about the meaning of a certain act of Congress, closed the whole at the end of the second day by calmly remarking, "Gentlemen, the act is repealed." Mr. Judge Begley of British Columbia, the terror of evildoers and of two sympathizing jurors, had occasion to caution a witness, "Don't prevaricate, sir, don't prevaricate. Remember that you are on oath." The excuse was, "How can I help it, Judge, when I have such a almighty bad toothache?" If the learning of the judge puzzles the witness, sometimes the dog Latin of the lawyers puzzles a judge. A short time ago, in San Francisco, a hotly contested case came on in a certain justice's court in the city, which is presided over by a magistrate with a strong antipathy to the dead languages and all who indulge in the affectation of using them. Plaintiff having put in his complaint in due form, the judge demanded what was the defendant's answer. Whereupon the defendant's counsel, who had been brought up under the old system, and still had a lingering love for scraps of law Latin, responded, "May it please the court, our answer is that the same subject matter and cause of action in this suit was the subject matter and cause of action in a previous suit already determined, in consequence of which the question now raised before your honor is res adjudicata." "Is what?" cried the judge, adjusting his spectacles. "Res adjudicata, if the court pleases." "Sir," roared the judge, "we allow no dead languages here. Plain English is good enough for us. The practice has abolished the dead languages, and if you give me any more of your Greek or Latin, I'll commit you, sir, for contempt of this court." In the early days of California, one of these rough-and-ready dispensers of the law held a court on a Sunday and sentenced a greaser, a native Californian or Mexican, according to the law then in force, to 39 lashes for theft. But on the prisoner's counsel threatening to apply for a writ of habeas corpus on the ground that it was unconstitutional to hold a court on a Sunday, the judge declared with a round oath that rather than the blessed greaser should get off by any such pettifogging trick, he would carry the sentence into effect right away. And then and there he applied the 39 lashes, the law limiting them to under 40, remarking when he had finished that the lawyer had better reserve his habeas corpus until the greaser's back had barked again. The Missouri sheriff might truly enough remark that jurymen are rather scarce. More than once a friend who knew the ways of the country has informed me, as a kindness, that there war a blessed jury trial a-gwine on down to Huntington City, as I reckon the sheriff's darned run for jurymen you'd better kind o' work around clar o' that locality. If I asked, how can I be a juryman, I am a foreigner, a stranger, a traveler, who has neither land nor lot, neither votes nor pays taxes. Ah, that would be mighty little count, would be the reply. You had paid taxes, for you paid your head money, and as for not being a resident, I reckon the sheriff'll soon make you out a resident, and as for your being a furriner, it don't matter shucks, that's the very thing you'll be spotted for. The sheriff has summoned every citizen to coroners and jury trials and every other darned sort of trial so mighty often that they swar if summoned much oftener they won't vote for him next election. And as 'lection comes on in March, I sort of reckon he'll like to corral a coon or two who ain't got no vote. At last I really was caught, and it was useless to remonstrate. The sheriff declared jurymen were scarce, and I must take a turn at it. To my astonishment, under the idea, I suppose, that I was a right smart chance of a scholar, I was chosen foreman of the jury, and in this capacity assisted in sending a man to the state's prison for 2 months, as a reward for his mechanical skill having been diverted into the channel of making bogus gold dust. We had considerable difficulty in arriving at a unanimous verdict, as 2 of the jury were personal friends of the prisoner. In this stage a backwoodsman, producing a pack of cards from his pocket, proposed that we should play 7 up for a decision, or if we objected to gambling, we could at least draw straws for it. At a little backwoods sawmill settlement called Alberni, Vancouver Island, an Indian had been stealing potatoes from a farm belonging to Mr. Sproat, the local justice, and in order to frighten this Indian, the man in charge, who was a western backwoodsman, fired his gun vaguely in the potato field direction. To his astonishment he shot the native dead. An inquest had to be held. The woodman, of course, looked upon a slain Indian as a very light affair, and several came to Mr. Sproat and said, "You're not going to trouble Henry about this, are you, sir?" Mr. Sproat, being not only master but a magistrate, had only to reply that however much he felt for a man's misfortune, he must let the law take its course. But where was a surgeon to be found to make a post-mortem examination? A careworn looking man stepped off a pile of lumber where he was working and said he was a surgeon. This statement being naturally received with some hesitation, he produced from an old army chest his commission, his degree, and ample proof of not only having been a medical man, but of once having been a staff surgeon. He soon produced a pea from the lung and showed that the Indian had died from gunshot wounds in the chest. Evidence was produced in corroboration, one of the witnesses testifying that the prisoner had said, "Jack, I've shot an Indian." The judge laid down their duty to the jury, which was composed of 12 of the most intelligent of the workmen, and they were sent into another room for their finding. It was nearly half an hour before they returned. The foreman then said, "We find the Siwash was worried by a dog." Footnote: Siwash, corrupted from the voyageurs sauvage, a savage, universally applied to Indians on the North Pacific coast. End note. "A what?" the judge exclaimed. "Worried by a dog, sir," said another juryman, fearing that the foreman had not spoken clearly. Assuming a proper expression of magisterial gravity, his worship pointed out to the jury the incompatibility of their finding with the evidence, and again went over the points of the case, calling particular attention to the medical evidence and the production by the doctor of the pea found in the body of the Indian. After which he, a second time, dismissed the jury to their room and begged them to come back with some verdict reasonably connected with the facts of the case. They were away longer than before. When they at length sidled back into the room for the second time, the judge drew a paper towards him to record their finding. "Now, men, what do you say?" Their decisive answer was, "We say he was killed by falling over a cliff." The judge shuffled his papers together and told the jurymen they might go to their work and he would return a verdict for them himself. For a full mile every way from where the dead body was found, the country was as level as a table. This jury was not so conscientious as another composed of the friends of some people accused of stealing pork. "We find the defendants not guilty, but we believe they hooked the pork." End of Part 2. Part 3 of The American Far West, 7 Mid-Nineteenth Century Views from Abroad, by Anonymous. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 3, Far Western Lawgivers and Preachers. Of course, there must be a legislature as soon as a rude territory is organized, and somebody must run for it, and somebody be elected in all the divisions to sit in the local parliament, and all who are so chosen have the title of honorable. Indeed, it seems as if in these parts of the world every government official, except the policeman, has this handle to his name. It does not always follow that these honorables are the worthiest men to be had, any more than it always follows that honorable members of the British Parliament comprise the flower of our British intellect. But one thing is certain in the West, at least, and probably over the whole of America, that the legislature is almost sure to contain the wordiest members of society, for to speak, or make a few remarks, on something is absolutely indispensable to a Western man. In the wilder parts of the settlements, members of legislature have often been elected, not so much for their talents as for being good hands at poker or great at a spree, and one of these, the honorable gentleman from Mariposa, on getting up to speak in the California legislature, and essaying several times without much effect, was greeted with shouts of "Get out! Oh, get out!" They mistook their man, however, for, as one of his supporters remarked before his election, "He ain't much on the speak, but just get him mad once and he'll give 'em fits." "Look ye here, gentlemen," he remarked, cocking a Derringer pistol, "ye may holler 'Get out! Get out!' as long as God'll let ye, but my speech is already begun, and the next man who shouts 'Get out!' in the House will bring to his ears the ominous clicking of small arms. What is it the gentlemen wish, and what would they have? Is my life so dear, or my peace so sweet, that it must be purchased at the expense of incapacitating a few on ye for military service? No, sirree, I know not what course others would take, but as for me, I will finish my speech, or there'll be a dead senator found round these premises in about 15 seconds by the clock." He was allowed to finish at his leisure. The late Dr. Henry, formerly Surveyor General of Washington Territory, among the many genial stories he used to tell, and which still keep his memory green, had one at the expense of his territorial legislature. A hotel keeper in one of the fashionable towns in the Eastern States used to stand at the head of the table and read out the bill of fare in what the elocution teachers called a clear, articulate voice, though there was a printed cart on the table. This irritated his aristocratic customers until at last one said, "Say, Cap, why do you read out the bill of fare? Do you think we can't read?" "Oh, gentlemen," was the reply, "you will excuse me, I hope. It is solely the force of habit. I once kept a hotel in Washington Territory, and most of the legislatoor boarded with me, and I'm blessed if half of 'em could read or write." It is a matter of history that when the convention met to form a constitution for California, and on the usual preamble being read that all men should be judged by a jury of their peers, an Oregonian, who happened to be a delegate, moved, to the great amusement of the other members, that the word peers should be struck out. "This warn't a monarchy. There warn't no peers in this here state." Disgraceful scenes of drunkenness are sometimes seen in these legislatures, but in this they do not stand alone. One of the Californian members of the United States Senate is distinguished as the sober senator, such a virtue being rather uncommon in the present congressman from that state. Corruption in these state legislatures prevails to a frightful extent, and is so open that newspapers will even have the hardihood to give a list of the sums paid to each senator for his vote. In the more refined states, official embezzlements are styled pickings, but in the Far West and Pacific States plain English suffices, and they are well known as stealings. More than once prominent government officials have asked me, while in social intercourse, how much salary I got for such an office. I would tell them. "Wall," would be the reply, "that ain't much for this country, but o' course you have got your little stealin's." I was naturally rather inclined to resent the insinuation of robbing my government or employers of any sort, until they would assure me that they meant no harm. It was the regular thing there, everybody did it. "Why, sir, do you think I can support my family on $1,500 a year in greenbacks at 60 cents to the dollar? Or that I would come up to this one-horse place, after having a practice as a lawyer in Frisco, of $10,000 a year for that? I guess not." All members of these legislatures are paid, and get, also, a certain mileage or traveling expense from their homes to the seat of government. This recompense, or per diem, as they call it, varies from about $10 to $15 a day, and is generally paid in the Pacific States in gold. The mileage is about 25 cents a mile. Now this, to a congressman traveling from Washington Territory, Idaho, Oregon, or California, comes up to a very round sum, and indeed is looked upon as their principal pay, always exclusive of the little stealings formerly mentioned. The local legislatures are limited by the state constitution to a sitting of so many days, and it would be well if the British colonial ones were under the same rule, for their unpaid twaddle is endless. And of course their pay only extends over that period. Sometimes they will finish their work in a much less time than the law allows for their sitting, but they have no notion of rising while their pay is going on. When not engaged in the anterooms of the Senate Hall in playing monte, cutthroat poker, encre, or 7-up, they can pass the time in introducing bogus or sham bills, generally a divorce for some of their own number, or a rule to show why another should not change his name, the wit and decency of which, I am told, are very much in the style of an institution once presided over in London by Chief Baron Nicholson. When Oregon was poor and humble, her rough names for her rivers and towns were good enough for them, but when she got rich, a bill was gravely introduced to change these names. Rogue River was to be called Gold River, gold just then being found on its banks, and so forth. It would probably have passed had not another supplemental bill been introduced, which provided that Jump Off Joe should be called Walk Along Joseph, that Greaser's Camp should be called the Halls of Montezuma, that Shirt Tail Bar should be styled Carrazza Beach, and so on. This fairly laughed the whole proposal out of court, though indeed on the official map an attempt was made to keep up some of these elegant appellations, and to Indianize the more outrageous of the names. In the way of legislative joking, it is a well-known fact that when a bill was introduced into the Georgia legislature to lay a tax of $10 a head upon all donkeys, a jocular member proposed to amend it so as to include lawyers and doctors, which amendment was passed amid loud applause. Various attempts have been made to repeal the clause, but in vain, and to this day a tax of $10 is levied upon all jackasses, lawyers, and doctors. In the Far West, as elsewhere, there are legislators who are not too much in earnest. I recommend to some of our present candidates for British suffrages the following noble, close to a Far Western election address. "Gentlemen," said the candidate, after having given his sentiments on the Constitution, the Monroe Doctrine, and such like topics, "Gentlemen," and he put his hand on the region of his heart, "these are my sentiments, the sentiments, gentlemen, of a honest man, a honest politician, but, gentlemen and fellow citizen, ef they don't suit you, they can be altered." To appear a plain sort of a man on these electioneering tours is quite as necessary as the old world baby kissing and shaking hands with the washed men, provided by your agent, are with us. I know a Western senator who keeps what he calls his stumping suit, hodden gray, well worn but whole, shoes patched but brightly polished, a shirt spotlessly clean but frayed at the edges of the seams, and a hat which has seen better days, but in its well-brushed condition quite keeps up the air its owner is striving to assume, humble but honest. After a campaign is over, the suit is carefully put aside until another election in which its owner is interested. The worthy senator, who is rather a dandy than otherwise, has filled every office from governor to hog-weave, and considers that his suit of humble but honest won him many a vote. "Money wouldn't buy it," he told me. "It ain't for sale nohow." It is commonly supposed that General Fremont lost his elections out West by dividing his hair down the middle. The Hon. Samuel M. has often assured me that on his first candidature for office in Oregon Territory, certain of the baser sort voted agin him because of his putting on airs in respect of wearing a white shirt, or, as they irreverently styled it, a boiled rag. I have put the State in the far West before the Church, for the Church there is of the future, although every place is not like Josephine County, where I was told, with a sort of depraved pride, "There ain't nary preacher nor meetin' house in this here county, Cap'n." In other places where the preacher gets a footing, it is sometimes easier to get a meetin' house full than to get wherewith to support the laborer, who is nowhere in the world more worthy of his hire. A preacher in a frontier settlement had been collecting money for some church project. There were still some $20 wanting, and after vain efforts to make up the deficiency, he plainly intimated, as he locked the church door one day after service, that he intended to have that said $20 before any of them left the house. At the same time he set the example by tossing $5 on the table. Another put down $1, another $0.25, a fourth $0.50, and so on. The parson read out every now and then the state of the funds. "Thar's 7½ my friends. Thar's 9¼ 10 and 6 bits are all that are in the hat, friends and Christian brethren." Slowly it mounted up. 12½, 14, 15, 16 and 3 bits, and so on until it stuck at $19½ "It only wants 50 cents, friends, to make up the amount. Will nobody make it up?" Everybody had subscribed, and not a cent more was forthcoming. Silence reigned, and how long it might have lasted it was difficult to say, had not a $half been tossed through the open window, and a rough explanatory voice shouted, "Here, parson, here's your money. Let out my gal. I'm about tired of waiting on her." The Long Tom Creek region in Oregon is settled by a very rough lot of people, mostly from Missouri. They are, even in Oregon, a proverb for the uncouth character of their manners, and it was thought quite a missionary enterprise when a devoted young clergyman from the States came and settled among them. Church was a novelty with them. It reminded them of old times in the States. They built a little church in the middle of a broad prairie, and for a time it was crowded every Sunday. The backwoodsmen and their families used to come to church in wagons and on horseback. The men had on fringed buckskin breeches and moccasins of Indian manufacture, and the head covered with coonskin caps, with the tail hanging in the form of a tassel behind. They would tie their horses up to the long hitchin' post in front of the church, and always brought their rifles to church with them, handy for any varmints which might cross their path, going and coming. It so happened one warm Sunday that the church door was opened, and a backwoodsman who happened to be near it was gazing vacantly out on the prairie in front. Suddenly he spied a deer close by, quietly grazing. Here was a chance. Slowly he took his rifle from the corner of his pew and crept out. His action was observed, and one after another followed, until nobody but a lame old man was left. By this time the deer was ambling over the prairie, and the whole congregation of men yelling and galloping in pursuit. Preaching was out of the question, for even the women and children were as eager as the men, watching the chase halfway over the prairie. The old man and the preacher stood alone together at the door of the church. The poor clergyman, in despair for the souls of his people, and thinking that he would have a sympathizer in the old man, who alone had not joined in the chase, sighingly said, "Lost! Lost!" Divil a bit of it, sir, divil a bit of it. They'll catch it. By jingo, they've plugged it. I knowed they would." The young minister received a haunch and brought the services to a close, but he was out of his element, and soon went East again, where he is in the habit of remarking, with unnecessary acrimony, that the Oregonians are a very careless people in heavenly matters. In the same part of the country, at a place called Caudle Bridge, I saw a deacon preach. His sermon was not very remarkable for vigor, but I can vouch for it that his squirting of tobacco juice over the pulpit rails was most forcible. I had noticed that for some seats next the reading desk the pews were unoccupied, though other parts of the church were crowded. After what I witnessed, I had no difficulty in accounting for the indisposition to sit under him too immediately. If the parson is sometimes rough, so are the parishioners. At church in a little backwoods settlement most of the congregation were asleep. Suddenly a half-tipsy fellow made an apple bump on the bald head of one of the sleepers. The preacher stopped and gave the offender an interrogative stare. "Bile ahead, parson, bile ahead, I'll keep 'em awake," was the ready explanation. The following incident has, I think, been told before, but still it is so characteristic that it is worth repeating. In California a miner had died in a mountain digging, and, being much respected, his acquaintances resolved to give him a square funeral, instead of putting the body in the usual way in any roughly made hole, and saying by way of service for the dead, "Thar goes another bully boy under." They sought the services of a miner who bore the reputation of having at one time of his career been a powerful preacher in the States. And then, far Western fashion, all knelt around the grave while the extemporized parson delivered a prodigiously long prayer. The miners, tired of this unaccustomed opiate, to while away the time began fingering the earth, digger fashion, about the grave. Gradually looks were exchanged, whispering increased, until it became loud enough to attract the attention of their parson. He opened his eyes and stared at the whispering miners. "What is it, boys?" Then, as suddenly, his eyes lighted on sparkling scales of gold. He shouted, "Gold, by jingo, and the richest kind of diggins! The congregation's dismissed!" Instantly every man began to prospect the new digging, our clerical friend not being the least active of the number. The body had to be removed and buried elsewhere, but the memory of the incident yet lives in the name of the locality, for Dead Man's Gulch became one of the richest localities in California. End of Part 3. Part 4 of The American Far West, 7 Mid-19th Century Views from Abroad, by Anonymous. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 4, Far Western Gamblers. In Far Western society it is no longer reputable to be known as a professional gambler, yet men who remember the days when everybody played will be apt to look lightly upon the vice. It is not uncommon, therefore, to see merchants, especially American, having a social game of cutthroat monte, euchre, or poker, with piles of gold before them. In the mountain towns it is still worse, and the anterooms of the Nevada and California legislators used to be a perfect carnival of gambling in the evenings, and even during the day, when they were not intent on gambling in the public weal. The tolerance of gambling and the widespread habit of betting show through many of the slang phrases in general use on the coast. Continually you will hear men and even women and children sometimes adding, after making some positive assertion, "You bet," or "You bet your life," or "You bet your bones," while to "bet your boots" is confirmation strong as Holy Writ, in the mines at least. A miner is always particular about his boots, their form and durability, and they are a common subject of conversation in the places where diggers most do congregate. Again, nobody in the Northwest will have any hesitation in telling you that such and such a statement is "played out," when he means to convey an imputation that you are somewhat beside the truth, or that the proposals you may be making to him are not suitable to his ideas of things right and fitting. If he further informs you that this has been played out since '49, he means that since the first colonization of the Pacific coast by smart men, such a thing was never believed in, 1849 being the year of the commencement of the Californian gold digging. A vote being taken on an important measure in the Indiana Senate, a grave and reverend senator who had not been attending to the biz at hand did not know what the question was when his name was called by the secretary. He looked puzzled for a moment, and then, rapping the desk with his knuckles after the manner of card players, said, "I pass." An audible titter ran through the hall, and the president of the Senate took it up. A divine in a far western state visited a distant town for the purpose of preaching the dedicatory sermon in a new church. Court was in session, and on Saturday the judge and lawyers congregated together in a room and amused themselves by card-playing and story-telling. The divine, at the request of a lawyer, visited the room. He came into the room so suddenly that they were unable to hide their cards and whiskey. The divine looked on a while, and then politely invited the gentlemen present to attend church next day and hear him preach. This they agreed to do, and Sunday found them, judge and lawyers, seated in the amen corner. The sermon over, the minister announced, "Friends, the citizens of this town have built a fine church. There is still $1,500 due. We propose to raise the money by subscription today, and," eyeing the judge, "I go 100, imitating the style of the gamblers of last night. The judge, glancing at the lawyers, slowly responded, "I see your 100. "Thank you, brother," said the divine. "Will any one raise it?" looking at the same time at attorney number 1. The lawyer saw that he was in for it, and quietly replied, "I go 100 blind," and so on through the list. The divine raked down both the bar and their money until the scene closed by a sharp, shrill voice announcing, "I see the last 100 and call you." The astonishment of the congregation can be imagined. I venture, however, to think that these lawyers will not soon invite the divine to witness another social game of euchre, when men see each other, go it blind, and call the hand. I can vouch myself for the exact truth of that story. The next I tell you from hearsay, and don't answer for, but as I have seen something very like it, I believe it may be true. At a far western court, the case of Smith versus Jones was called up. "Who's for the plaintiff?" inquired the judge impatiently. "May it please the court," said a rising member of the legal fraternity, "Pilkins is for the plaintiff, but I left him just now over in the tavern playing a game of poker. He's got a sucker there, and he is sure to skin him right smart, if he has only time. He's got everything all set to ring a cold deck, in which case he'll deal for himself 4 aces, and his opponent 4 queens, so that your honor will perceive that he must rake the persimmons." Footnote: A southern fruit, but here, of course, applied to money. An expressive western phrase is, "The longest pole will knock down the persimmons," i.e., the longest head will win. End note. "Dear me," said the judge with a sigh, "that's too bad. It happens at a very unfortunate time. I am very anxious to get on with this case." A brown study followed, and at length a happy idea struck the judge. "Bill," said he, addressing the friend of the absent Pilkins, who had just spoken, "you understand poker about as well as Pilkins. Suppose you go over and play his hand?" And Bill did it. We have another phase of the gambling spirit in the extraordinary bets which are now and again recorded in the papers. An old Jew miser in San Francisco, being irritated on one occasion by jests at his love of money, proposed that the man who was baiting him should go with him in a boat into the middle of the bay, where for every $20 gold piece the Jew should toss overboard, the other should toss over $5, and let them see who would be first to cry hold. Both being excessively purse-proud, the bet was accepted, and the scene was witnessed by hundreds. The Jew's opponent was the first to save his dollars. The Gridley sack of flour, which became glorious about the time of the American Sanitary Commission for the benefit of the wounded soldiers in the Army, was the effect of a bet, and the story of its sale and resale is thoroughly illustrative of this wild extravagance. There were two candidates for the mayoralty of the village of Austin, in Nevada, a city in the wildest part of the desert, and not then 2 years old, but with 5,000 inhabitants. Each candidate had agreed, if defeated, to carry a sack of flour on his back from Austin to a neighboring village in broad day. Accordingly, when Mr. R. G. Gridley lost his election, he prepared to fulfill his engagement. Headed by a band of music in a wagon, leading his little boy, clad in the national uniform, by the hand, and with a sack of flour on his back, followed by a mongrel procession of miners and citizens, Mr. Gridley took up his foot journey to the appointed place. Arrived there, the thought struck him that the gay spirits and patriotic feelings of the crowd, which grew as he traveled, might be turned to humane account. He instantly proposed now to sell the sack of flour for the benefit of the sick and wounded in the army to the highest bidder. The humor took. The sack was sold and sold again, netting $5,000. The amount realized fired the ingenious Gridley with a resolve to make the most of his lucky idea. Accordingly, he started for a journey of 300 miles to Virginia City with the sack of flour in company. Arriving on a Sunday, and finding a sanitary commission meeting going on in the theater, he proceeded to the place, got admitted to the stage, and there, telling his story to the audience, sold the sack to the audience for $580. The next morning, having procured a band of music, he proceeded to make a tour of the neighboring towns, Gold Hill, Silver City, and Dayton, selling the sack wherever he could find bidders, and adding the price labeled on the face of this more than Fortunatus purse. At Gold Hill the sack sold for $5,822.50. At Silver City for $830. At Dayton for $873. Finally, returning to Virginia City again, the sack, putting forward all its attractions, won a prodigious subscription of $12,025. Mr. Gridley, pursuing his successful way, arrived at Sacramento just as a sanitary commission picnic was in progress. In the midst of the festivities he marched into the crowd, a band of music leading the way, a stalwart negro walking by his side carrying the sack, and an extempore procession following him, which grew larger every moment, and presented himself for new conquests to the officers of the day and the president of the commission. Notwithstanding the stimulus of patriotism and champagne, the sack did not fare so well here as before. But here several supplementary wrinkles of humor were suggested by the sack. Among others, a good woman, finding a small island of a few rods square in the swamp, had erected a bridge of one plank, and established such a rate of toll that to see nothing there cost the curiosity of some hundreds $50 each. Then the president of the commission was invited to shake hands with some hundreds of the company, who bought the privilege at from 50 cents to a double eagle $10 apiece, making his hat his till until it was literally half full of silver and gold. Carried thence to Sacramento, the sack was sold again at a public lecture by the Rev. Dr. Bellows for several $100, and finally transported to San Francisco. It added moderate gains to its enormous harvest even at that comparatively staid community. 6 months later, the sack, with its irrepressible owner, arrived in New York, en route for the great fair at St. Louis. He did not stop there, and I believe the sum realized by the subscription given in this odd way to the sanitary fund was not much short of $40,000, or £8,000. Closely allied to the spirit of gambling is the reckless and mercurial temperament of the Western man. When Sacramento was being destroyed by fire, and many a man saw his whole worldly substance going to ruin, some of the merchants managed to save some champagne, and, going outside the town, drank "Better luck next time, this is a great country." Next day a tavern keeper had a space cleared among the ruins, and over a little board shanty hastily run up was this inscription: "Lafayette House, drinks 2 bit, who cares a darn for a fire?" What energy these people have! I know a carpenter who arrived at a village one morning with his wife and child and chest of tools, but having no lumber (wood), he pawned most of the tools to buy some. He then obtained the privilege of building on a vacant lot, and commenced at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. At 5 o'clock the house was enclosed. At sunset his family moved into the house, and in less than an hour afterwards the good wife had supper ready. The family slept in the house that night. Men who can work like that believe in work, and have no fear of "busting up." A young English nobleman, heir of one of the richest peers in England, while waiting at a remote country station one day, entered into conversation with one of the neighbouring settlers. "Been in these parts considerable, stranger?" "Yes, for some length of time." "How long hae you been here?" "A few weeks." "What's your business?" "I have no business." "What are you travelling for, then?" "Only for my own pleasure." "Don't you do any business? How do you get your living, then?" "It isn't necessary for me to work for my support. My father is a man of property, and gives me an allowance sufficient for my wants." "But suppose the old man should die?" "In that case, I dare say he'd leave me enough to live upon." "But suppose he should bust up?" Here the conversation ended, his lordship walking away, apparently struck by a new idea. Travel is safe on most far western roads, where there are no hostile Indians about. Yet, partly through old habit, partly as a precaution absolutely necessary in some places, nearly everybody goes armed, and it is wonderful how many pistols will flash out when a street fight arises in any western town, or even in San Francisco itself. A San Franciscan, who is justly proud of having helped to rear up so polite a town in a comparatively short time, is very jealous on this point. He continually impresses on a stranger that "nobody, sir, carries weapons nowadays," and he would perhaps convince you of this abstract doctrine, did not one of the chilly forenoon winds blow up Montgomery Street and expose a neat Colt at the waistband of his trousers. I saw a man kneeling before me in a certain church in San Francisco, and as his coat tail divided, the handle of a huge navy revolver showed itself. The knowing men, however, carry Derringer pistols in their coat pockets. You can always know, a shrewd old miner explained to me, when a man has a pistol in his pocket, by the way he sits down in a chair. If he plumps down, he's safe, but if he sits down cautiously and looks arter his coat tails, he's on the shy out, certainly. The same with the knife. Horsemen, when travelling, carry it in the boot, and footmen down the neck. Hence a bowie knife is popularly known as a Kansas neck blister. But as for the far western rowdies, Montana and Idaho territories are at present the only regions in the North Pacific globe where they have anything like full swing for their playfulness. In Idaho region I heard of a man who came rushing down the one street of a mining village on a Sunday morning. He had been attracted by a noise, and came on shouting, "What's the matter?" Presently his excitement abated. "Oh, only a man shot. Why, I thort it was a dorg fight." In that locality they used to ask at breakfast, in a careless, unconcerned way, with their mouths full, "Who was shot last night?" And they generally had a dead man to breakfast. Nevada has become rather more peaceable since it was elevated to the dignity of a State, but at one time, and in some places yet, if one gentleman riled another, it was the correct thing that the gentleman who was vexed at him should ask in a piquant tone whether he was healed, and if he replied yes, why then it was etiquette to tell him to turn loose. An official went to a certain nameless State, and inquired of one of the leading men for the sight of a copy of the State laws. The leading man was very polite, went to a drawer, and, producing a bowie knife about 1.5 feet in length, most sententiously replied, "Here, sir, is a complete edition of them." San Francisco is now a very peaceable town, and no longer would you, when taking an airing in front of your door, be startled by a bullet whizzing past your ear, and a gentleman emerging from the dark to apologize for disturbing you, having mistaken his man. In the old days a culprit was hung for stealing an ounce of gold, but was only fined heavily for killing a man. A rowdy would take a bet that he would bring down a man on the other side of the street. If the man shot had no friends, and if there were enough hard swearing and bribery, it was almost certain that the murderer would get off with slight punishment. These were the days when Ned McGowan was judge, than whom no greater scoundrel was ever expelled San Francisco by the Vigilance Committee. Still, street fights are not over. Only recently a man was publicly shot down in San Francisco, but his murderer got off because several witnesses swore that they saw the assassinated man put his hand behind as if intending to draw. In the same street, the most fashionable and crowded thoroughfare in San Francisco, there was a fight lately described in this cool, matter-of-fact way by a morning paper. Quote, "There was a serious shooting affray in our principal street (Montgomery), which resulted in the death of 4 persons. It seems one Bill Davis, a noted gambler, who resides in Yreka, was interested in and drove a horse race which came off at Placerville on the 15th instant, and throwed the race, making $4,500 by it. Hank Stevens, Ball, Dutch Abe, and Spanish Bob, 4 sports, backed Davis's horse and got broke, swore vengeance, killing at sight, and so forth. On the 18th they all came to this city except Davis, and publicly said they were going to shoot Davis on sight, and so forth. On the 21st Davis came in town, and at 2 p.m. was getting his boots polished in a black's adjoining the Fashion, when Ball and Dutch Abe came to the door, and looking in exclaimed, 'Here's the dirty thief now!' and drawing their revolvers commenced shooting. Davis jumped out of the chair with one boot polished, and drawing his revolver, fired, and Ball fell dead across an iron grating. Davis then jumped out on the sidewalk, laughingly saying, 'You've made a mistake,' and fired Dutch Abe, the ball taking effect in his right breast. He fell, when Davis ran and caught the revolver from Ball's hand, saying, as he walked to the door of the Fashion, 'Where's the rest of your murderers now?' Blood was running down Davis's left hand from the arm, and also down the right cheek. As he was on the point of entering the door, he was met by Stevens and Spanish Bob, when Davis raised the revolver and fired twice. Stevens fell, and Spanish Bob jumped over him onto the sidewalk and fired. Davis staggered, but recovering, they, Davis and Spanish Bob, commenced in good earnest, each striving to fire a deadly shot. Davis was laughing. Then they commenced firing at each other about 20 feet apart. After Davis had fired 2 shots, he threw the revolver at Bob, and changing the revolver he took from Ball into his right hand, he raised it, and it snapped 3 times. The 4th time it went off, and Bob fell. Davis had fallen before this, and was lying with his face on the banquette. Davis threw the revolver into the street, with blasphemies duly reported. He then pulled a derringer, and both having 1 shot each, began crawling towards each other on their stomachs. When about 5 feet apart, they both raised, partly up, and fired simultaneously, when Bob's head fell, and he remained perfectly still. Davis then said, crawling towards Bob, "He's gone. I've cooked his goose," and then partly turned on his side and tried to rise. On examination, Ball and Spanish Bob were dead, Dutch Abe and Stevens mortally wounded, the first having been shot through the right lung, causing internal hemorrhage, and so forth. The latter was shot through the left breast. Spanish Bob had 4 wounds on him, 2 in the right breast, on the right arm, and 1 between the eyes. Ball had a ball in his heart. Davis had 6 wounds, 2 in the right leg, 1 in the right breast, 1 in the left shoulder, 1 in the left wrist, through, and 1 on the right cheek, where a bullet had struck the cheekbone and glanced off, cutting out a piece of flesh of the size of a 10-cent piece. Stevens died on the 24th at 40 minutes past 10 a.m. Dutch Abe died yesterday. Doctors say Davis will certainly recover." End quote. It used to be at one time, and is yet, in the rougher places, a signal for shooting if a man refused to drink with another, whether an acquaintance or not, or whatever his character. Behind the bar of a hotel at Reese River in 1863 was the following announcement: All guests in the house to be up by 7 o'clock. All in the barn by 6 o'clock. Every man to sweep out his own sleeping place. No fighting at the tables. No quarts taken at the bar. Any man violating these rules will be shot. Sociability may, like hostilities in the Far West, be carried too far. I was once called an unsociable sort of a beggar by the landlord of a roadside hostelry in British Columbia, because, after having had a general lay-out on the floor with 4 Gentile miners, I objected to the company of a 5th companion in the shape of a Jew peddler. But the Far Western instinct recognizes that the line must be drawn somewhere. There was once a Western governor named Powell, famous for chewing and spitting, of whom somebody remarked that he was a very sociable man. "Sociable," replied the individual addressed, "I rather think he is darned sociable. I was introduced to him over to Grayson Springs last fall, and he hadn't been with me 10 minutes before he begged all the tobacco I had, got his feet up in my lap, and spat all over me. Darned sociable." End of Part 4. Part 5 of The American Far West, 7 Mid-Nineteenth Century Views from Abroad, by Anonymous. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 5, Far Western Man. The far western American settlements of Great Britain and the United States yield us, in odd freedom from conventionalities of life and off-hand settlement of difficulties, much matter for laughter, but none for ridicule. There is a grandeur of its own in human energy that not only conquers land and wealth to the use of mankind, but proves the inner soundness of the stuff men are made of, by conquering also the bad passions of life. In regions to which lawless men are tempted by the absence of all civilized machinery of law, the rascals are at last compelled to stand in awe of honest men. Throughout the Far West, tracks of travel have been cleared of the white robber and assassin, and are safe, except here and there, from the hostility of native tribes. Property lying exposed to theft is, in many a new Western settlement, safer than in one of the towns of the old country. Public opinion has condemned the gambler and condemns the idler. The foundations of a new society laid thus in the Far West, however rough they may appear, are strong and sound, and it is wonderful to see how fast the well-proportioned building rises from them. Races of North and South join in the West and do their pioneer work in a practical, hard-headed way, parted, no doubt, from some of the advantages, but also from all the overgrown hypocrisies of civilization. I look with respect even upon whittling as a symptom of the restless desire to be doing as well as talking. In the North Pacific, where there are such extensive forests and odd pieces of wood are lying handy, whittling seems to be the regular occupation of men's idle hours. The municipality of San Francisco put up wooden posts to protect the sidewalks from fiery charioteers. Over these hung knots of eager disputants, and as mining stocks and swamp lands were being discussed, they whittled at the posts until they became so thin that the wind blew them over. I have seen a man in a backwood church begin whittling the wood of the pew. At a trial in Grass Valley, each juryman began whittling at a piece of wood he had brought in his pocket for the purpose, regulating the energy of the action by the clearness of the evidence. The trial lasted through a second day, but as they had not expected a long sitting, nobody had brought enough wood with him, and accordingly the benches suffered. First, the gentlemen of the jury attacked that portion of the seat which showed between their legs, until it had assumed a Van Dyck collar-like form, and the assault on the other portion had proceeded so far, when the judge finished his charge, that he made a calculation that if the ends of justice had required the jury to sit for a third day, there would have been nothing left for them to sit on. Old skippers hang about the wharf also whittling. At Coos Bay there are only 2 marriageable girls, and these, being run after by all the young men of the district, value themselves accordingly. Half a dozen Oregonian youths sit on the veranda in front of their respective houses during the whole of Sunday, while each lady looks out at her followers through the half-opened window. The lovers all the while are whittling bits of white pine, which is an easy wood to work, and valued for that purpose. At dark they move home, but the damsels find these visits profitable, for there is generally left behind a pile of shavings big enough to light fires for the rest of the week. The Western man is a being of versatile genius. If he cannot succeed in one profession, he will turn to another. There are plenty of lawyers who are miners, and merchants who are doctors, all over the Northwest. The head of the largest mercantile firm on the Pacific coast is one who was educated for and practiced many years in the medical profession, and some of the most adroit politicians and wire pullers are styled "doctor" from having at one time been in the same way in life. If one trade does not pay, he commences in another, and if there is not an opening in Bullet City, he vamooses the ranch, makes tracks, or gets up and gits for the Ground Hog's Glory, where there is said to be an excellent opening for either a butcher or a lawyer or a tavern keeper. He will establish himself in one or other of these callings, probably to bust up, or to make $250,000. He is always going to make just that particular sum. He knows thoroughly that art, without which no new country can grow great, the noble art of coming down. Generals and brigadier generals of the great Civil War are earning honest bread by industry. The dashing cavalry leader to whom the young ladies wrote poems is in the grocery trade at Chicago. One famous officer has gone back to the plow, another is a newspaper reporter, another is writing a history of Texas while practicing law and photography. The photography pays best, for he has a contrivance of his own for giving the Mexicans a very pale picture, which is said to suit them exactly, as they have a desire to appear as white as possible. Of such stock comes the true Western pioneer. Notwithstanding the banter about his being so long in the legs and short in the body that a hat and a pair of trousers make a good suit of clothes for him, he is a stalwart, sinewy fellow, infinite of resource, rough in his talk, with little learning and no formal piety. Ready to work, no matter how often fortune defeats him, he is ever hopeful of wrestling through somehow. A peculiar character has grown up in the valley of the Mississippi, which may be called the Western character. From the Mississippi it has spread, and is daily spreading more and more to Columbia. It is the outgrowth of all circumstances surrounding it, including climate and soil and the mingling of bloods. It tends to individualism, freedom, self-reliance, and large views. There is little of narrow sectarianism in its secular life or religion, little provincialism, that is to say, little of the prejudice that lives on for generations in an untraveled community. The Western character develops freedom and takes in large calculations. This is more true of the man of Western cities than of the farmer and the frontier man, but still the character applies to all. A Western man thinks nothing of going 1,000 or 1,500 miles, and has no traditional feud with any class of Jew or Gentile. The elements of various nationalities flowing together westward form a strong and tolerant community. If a man out West has his horse stolen, he mounts another and traces the thief, shoots him if he can. The extending prairies, immense lakes, grand rivers seem to enlarge the whole conception of things. The big farm yields thousands of bushels of grain. The Western man may have 20 horses, 100 mules, and 1,000 head of cattle grazing in his pastures, and 500 pigs fattening in his fields. He reads the price currents, knows all that is going on, forms his own opinions, and is loud and bold in the expression of them. He is a man of patient courage, who will lose thousands of dollars by the fall of the market, and make less account of it than he would of the laming of a favorite horse or the loss of a faithful dog. If he doesn't turn his loss off with a laugh, and is pushed to speak of it, you may see the gleam of stern grit flashing from his eyes as he tells you he will do better next time. He is full of reckless and mercurial daring. As impulsive as the Southerner, and yet practical in all things, he sees and takes always the shortest cut to his end. Feeling about the sacred character of ancestral acres never disturbs the mind of a man whose possessions were reclaimed from the wilds but yesterday and may be left to-morrow. Whatever he has he will sell, and whatever you own he is willing to buy, providing he can make some boot on it. With him all things were made to buy and sell. A frontier man once described to me, without the least idea of the strange character of the transaction, how he had traded off a Bible for a plaguey good fiddle. If anything you have on you or about you strike his fancy, he will at once offer to buy it, and has no notion that certain pieces of property mayn't be for sale. My own experience has lain chiefly among the vanguard of these pioneers, the frontier man who paves the way for others less able or willing to cope with fortune; less traders than laborers upon the land. These are the people who are fast filling up with stern prose of the plow and the reaping machine and the whistle of steam what was once claimed by the pleasant poetry of the songs of the voyageurs, the coureurs des bois, and the hunters and trappers of the great fur companies. But perhaps it is better after all. Much as I have lived with the frontier man, I have grown in liking for the pioneer who is always moving west. Hailing generally from some border state, early in life he has settled down on some donation claim. Making it his boast that he is half horse, half alligator, with a touch of snapping turtle, he soon has a good farm about him, and remains until, by the miserable style of agriculture learned in the cotton lands of the Mississippi, he exhausts the soil, or until he considers himself inconveniently crowded, upon hearing that he has got a neighbor 8 miles off and more a-comin', then he calculates he'll move west, and is not long before he guess he'll locate, still on the frontier in some little big snipe swamp or dead Indian prairie. And there he does locate, until the old causes operating or his land becoming valuable, he sells out to some less enterprising settler, hitches up his old bullock team once more, and with his loose cattle, his horses, his long Kentucky rifle, his Douglas axe, his copper camp kettle, and his long-handled frying pan, off he goes. Not forgetting his bouncing gals, who rightly boast that they can lick their weight in wildcats, his 4 stalwart sons, each of whom can shoot the bristles off a wolf and drive a furrow so straight that, as they tell you, if followed up, it would knock the center outer the North Star, Colonel. He moves and moves, still west. Rumbling every summer over the Great Plains go hundreds of such teams and many such men, each fighting his way among Sioux and Blackfoot and Snake until we find him in Oregon, Idaho, Nevada, or Washington Territory, and possibly he even roams down open-mouthed in his wonder to Californy. But this part of the world is generally too civilized for him, and the polished Californians are not kindly affected to the individual in buckskin or homespun, whom they profanely call the yaller-bellied Missourian. The pioneer of pioneers must have been one Jedediah S. Smith, called Jed for shortness, who on the 20th of December, 1826, strayed too far into the great desert, and from want of provision and water to get home with, was compelled to push forward. It therefore stands upon record as one of the many triumphs of the Smith family that one of them was the first to make the overland trip from the States to California. Fortunately, Jedediah found American shipmasters from Boston and Nantucket who vouched for his honest intentions and perfect harmlessness. He had attempted, during the latter part of the preceding winter, to make his way up the Columbia River, but the snow was so deep on the mountains that he was obliged to return. Being informed by one of the Christian Indians that the father would like to know who he was, Jedediah wrote a letter to Father Duran, who lived at San Jose, in which he honestly confessed that he was destitute of clothing and most of the necessaries of life, that his horses had perished for want of food and water, that his object was to trap for beavers and furs, and in conclusion he signed himself, Your strange but real friend and Christian brother. Jed has been followed since then by many thousands, scattered now along the frontier. Among them it was my pleasant lot to wander many a day, and if they were queer fellows, they were good fellows, of more use to the world, I think, than many a fine gentleman who has never lifted heavier tool than an opera glass, or served his country with a stroke of thought. End of Part 5. Part 6 of The American Far West, 7 Mid-Nineteenth Century Views from Abroad by Anonymous. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 6, Far Western Chinese, The Chinese Far from Home. Traveling over the mountain trails almost anywhere in California, no matter how remote and solitary may be your route, you can scarcely fail to meet a curious figure, sloping-eyed, yellow-complexioned, with a shaved head and pigtail carefully secured in a twisted knot behind, clad in a loose cloth or calico garment, half shirt, half jacket, trousers equally wide, a long bamboo pole over his shoulder, on either end of which, carefully balanced, are a sack of rice, a piece of pork, and a heterogeneous mass of mining tools, and over all the head of this strange individual is covered with a hat made of slips of bamboo, the brim of which equals in breadth a moderately sized umbrella. This is John Chinaman from home, finding his fortune. He always answers to the name of John. He follows many ways of making his modicum of rice, and the representative of Chinese industry in this case is Mining John. The white miners only allow him to labor at the poorer diggings, or at others which have been so well wrought over as no longer to yield returns enough to satisfy their ideas as to wages. Accordingly, we find John at work in some remote locality which the stronger race has deserted, or which is too poor to tempt them to drive out the Chinese. In former times this was frequently done, and in the old California newspapers reports of such outrages, or of meetings at which resolutions to do so were passed, are quite common. Some years ago I had occasion to pass a few days with some Chinese miners in the mountains. They numbered some 20 men, and occupied the deserted cabins of the miners who had formerly wrought in the locality. Every morning they would go down to the river side and labor, steadily washing the gravel for gold until midday, when their slight meal of rice and vegetables was partaken of. At 6 o'clock or thereabouts they stopped work for the day, and, after carefully washing themselves in the river, they prepared supper. I was the only white there, and had made an arrangement with them about my meals. Accordingly, my supper was first prepared, an office which I generally superintended, as they had, according to my observation, a nasty habit of incorporating rattlesnakes, frogs, slugs, and such small deer in their stews. After supper they would look to their little patches of watermelons, cabbages, and so forth, and their head man would talk to me about his daily life, or the province he had come from, and to which he hoped before long to return. The greater portion of them, however, after they had weighed out the proceeds of the day's labor, and allotted each man his share by the aid of a swan pan, a sort of miniature Babbage's calculating machine, would place themselves on their sleeping benches, put a little tray before them on which were all the materials for smoking, and soon drug themselves into a dreaming stupidity with the fumes of opium. Their huts were situated amid the most beautiful scenery, by the banks of a fine river, over which cataracts from the snow-covered mountains in the distance fell, gurgling or roaring, into the waters below. But for all this, on which I never tired of gazing, my hosts seemed to care little. They had no visitors, save an Indian on horseback now and then, who treated them very cavalierly and rarely dismounted. On Sundays they generally laid over from work, not from any religious motive, as they were Buddhists, but merely as a day of rest, and sometimes, if they had been more than ordinarily successful, one of them would go to the town or trading port, distant some 10 miles, and buy some provisions and a bottle of a beverage called, I quote the label, "Fine Old Tom," over which they made very merry for a few hours, playing a rude description of musical instrument sounding like a paralytic drum. They made, however, poor pay, generally not more than 3 or 4 shillings per diem each, though now and then they would come on a lucky pocket and return in the evening grinning from ear to ear. The ground was, however, getting exhausted, and they were then talking of putting their household gods on the bamboo pole, and of removing to some more favored locality which they had heard of. Go down into almost any town or village, and you will find John moving about with that same silent air of his. Here he generally follows the business of a laundryman. All through the by-streets and suburbs you can see his little cabin with a signboard informing that here lives Wang Ho, washing and ironing, buttons sewed on; and peeping through the window you see the proprietor busily at work clear starching or ironing out the frills on the shirt bosom of probably the governor himself. He has a large pan full of lighted charcoal, which he uses as a flat iron, and his mouth is full of water, which he most adroitly sprinkles over the linen in a fine shower. If you have any foul clothes, he will follow you home, take them away, and return them again in a day or two, charging about 6d. apiece for his trouble, bargaining, however, that he has not to find linen collars for paper ones which may have been dropped in. From the frequent warnings of Washing John on this subject, I suspect that it is a custom of the colonial gentlemen by which our friend has suffered in time past. In the suburbs of every town Agricultural John is busy at work, clearing the most unlikely pieces of ground for the purpose of raising vegetables for the town market. These farmers, or rather market gardeners, are generally in companies of 3 or 4, and if you pass that way you can generally find one or other of the bucolic partnership driving the old cart and still older horse either from or to market. If the latter is the case, it is usually filled with several casks of garbage, and so forth, which the industrious proprietor has bought or begged from the hotel keepers for feeding his pigs with. Shopkeeping John is of a rather more aristocratic type. He still wears his country's dress, but it is of a fine material, and his shoes are of the best description, with the thickest of felt soles. He is also more particular about his person, and shaves his head with greater regularity than any of the labouring classes, much to the advantage of his personal appearance; for however smart a Chinaman may look with his sprucely shaven head and neat pigtail, he looks a most atrocious scoundrel when the hair is beginning to grow down on his forehead. These little shops are chiefly patronized by their own nation, or by the peddlers who at all seasons, but more especially in the winter when the outlying settlers find it inconvenient to come into town for trifling purchases, perambulate the country with 2 huge hampers swung as usual on either end of a bamboo pole over the dealer's shoulder. Most obliging are these Chinese peddlers, and they always make a point, every Christmas, of making some little present to their chief customers and to the children. Most of the large storekeepers and wholesale dealers are men of education and refinement, standing well with the commercial community, but except on rare occasions never mingling in any society but that of their own people. A few of them keep cheap eating-houses or restaurants, frequented by sailors and others who have no objection to a dinner composed of very dubious materials, so long as its cost does not exceed a shilling or 18d. Many of them are general servants, and in almost every house in Northwest America the cook is a Chinaman. Female servants are rare, expensive, and most independent, so that our Asiatic friends have almost a monopoly of the kitchen. They get for such services from $15 to $20 per week, with board and lodging, while the young ladies who condescend to do "house helping" will demand from $30 to $40, coupled with the bargain that they are not to brush boots and are to have 2 nights a week, and the whole of Sunday to themselves. They are not strong enough for laborers, but what they lack in muscle they make up in industry. Accordingly, working for moderate wages, a large number of them are employed on public works like the Pacific Railroad. Indeed, it is principally owing to the assistance rendered by them that the rapid formation of the portion of the line already completed on the west side of the Rocky Mountains is due. They were also employed in considerable numbers on the Panama Railroad, but had to be discontinued as they had a disagreeable habit, when the day was very warm, of fastening themselves by their pigtails to the dump cart used to empty the earth into the Chagres River. They also employ themselves, to some extent, in catching and drying fish for the Chinese market. Every year they preserve several tons of the albacore or ear shell for exportation to Canton, where it is used in a variety of manufactures. Even their signboards are painted by themselves, as it is dangerous to employ a jocular American, especially when under the influence of Monongahela whiskey. Near San Francisco is a Chinese washing house, surmounted by a signboard, informing the passers-by that all's well, we may be happy yet, you bet, which, no doubt, the innocent proprietor supposes to be an eloquent announcement anent washing and ironing. Most of their large firms' designations do not express the names of the owner or owners, but are symbolic. For instance, they mean the wide-spreading firm, the firm of the flowery land, and so on. All of their food, clothing, and so on, with the exception of pork, boots, or mining tools, are imported from China. Some years ago they were detected carrying on a most lucrative business in importing a liquid called Chinese wine, which was discovered to be a very strong brandy, and accordingly, notwithstanding its name, excisable in the highest duties. If a Chinese dies in a foreign country, Mongol theologians seem to be agreed that it will go hard for him in the afterworld unless his bones repose in the flowery land. Accordingly, the companies which bring the Chinese immigrants over to California are under contract to take them back again after a certain period, dead or alive. A Chinese funeral is a curious scene in San Francisco. A special burying ground called the Yerba Buena Cemetery is set apart for celestial repose. When carrying the body to the grave, a solemn individual scatters little slips of paper with wise aphorisms from Confucius written on them on either side, and on the lintels of their doorways are strips of red paper, on which are inscribed similar wise saws. On the grave is placed a roast fowl, some rice, and a bottle of Chinese wine, after which the mourners depart, never looking behind them. There is, however, another class of gentlemen who assist at the departed funeral, who are not so backward. A number of the rowdies of San Francisco, who are concealed near at hand, no sooner see the last of the mourners than they make a rush for the edibles and drinkables left for the benefit of Joss, and very soon make short work of them, Joss no doubt getting the credit. After lying some months in the grave, the bones are dug up and carefully cleaned and polished with brushes, tied up and put into little bundles, which are nicely labeled and stowed away in a small tin coffin in the particular hong or commercial house which is responsible for them. Footnote: I notice an advertisement in a California paper about a new earthenware coffin combining the advantages of durability, cleanliness, and cheapness, which latter virtue will no doubt commend it to the Chinese undertakers. The editor, in a paragraphic puff, remarks that anyone having once used this coffin would use no other. End note. When a sufficient number of these interesting mementos have accumulated, a ship is chartered and the coffins dispatched with their contents back to Shanghai, Canton, or Hong Kong. I saw a vessel in San Francisco harbor laden with 400 dead Chinese. On some of the silent mountain trails I have come across some of these lonely graves, only marked with a cleft stick, in which was stuck a slip of red paper with the name of the deceased, followed by one of the sage maxims of Confucius, about the vanity of things earthly, which the subject of The Cousin of the Moon Who Lay Below had already experienced in his own person. Every year thousands of Chinese are entering to supply the place of those who leave, so that instead of decreasing, their numbers are increasing with the country. Nobody likes John overmuch, and some of the baser sort have the most determined enmity to him. The storekeepers don't like him because he deals with his own people, though they forget that he takes nothing from them, and sometimes does put something in their pocket for mining tools. Beside, all John's dealings are for ready money, for though he may haggle long enough about the price, yet he gets no credit, though worse men may. The laborer doesn't like him, for he works for lower wages than he. This is a favorite subject of growling with these lazy loafers as they doze away in bar rooms with their feet on the top of the stove. Yet there is room for all of them, and the Chinese are only taken because white men can't be got. Politicians don't take him up because he doesn't vote, and therefore is of no account in municipal or state elections, and is not to be conciliated, while the newspaper editor, who ought to put in a good word for him, is very lukewarm on the subject, for John does not advertise, while his detractors do. Accordingly, poor John is kicked and abused with very little chance of redress. He is hunted out of every good mining locality, and he may think himself well off if he is not robbed, and has his pigtail cut off as a lesson to him, when of course the local paper will be sure to repeat the time-honored joke about a long tail being cut short. Formerly rowdies thought it good fun to catch a Chinaman and cut his tail off, though, as every one who knows that people is aware, he would as soon you took his life, as he is an outcast among his co-religionists until his hair grows. Some of them are Christians, and have given up this method of hair-dressing, but these are rare exceptions. I am glad, however, to say that of late years the California legislature have made it a penal offense to cut off a Chinaman's pigtail. At the same time, I never heard of anybody being punished, though there are plenty of pigtails lopped off. In the streets he is openly insulted. In Christian California I have seen a poor harmless Chinese stoned by boys until he was bleeding, hardly one being manly enough to take his part. I have heard of others after whom ruffians would hound their dogs, while the poor persecuted man was torn and bleeding, and the law touched his assailants not. The law passes acts against him, taxes him heavily as he enters, taxes him for making his living, and taxes him at every turn. It is quite a perquisite of the local official, this Chinese taxation, and he is either a very just or by no means a smart man, who cannot make a revenue out of the unfortunate Celestial. Even the Digger Indian, taking example from his superiors, persecutes and robs John also, if he finds him in the mountains, and as our poor friend will do anything rather than fight, he comes off very poorly indeed. John, it must be acknowledged, has an insuperable objection to paying taxes, notwithstanding his being in early life accustomed to be squeezed by a mandarin in his own country, and he will often take to the mountains when he hears of the sheriff coming his way. In southern Oregon, where nearly all the diggings are occupied by Chinese, the sheriff, in order to take them by strategy, has to send a few deputies in the guise of miners, with packs of blankets on their backs, who surprise John before he has time to escape, and if he shows any symptoms of resistance, with a revolver at his head, force him to pungle down the dust. I remember hearing a few years ago of some Chinese who, expecting the tax gatherer, went and took refuge in a cave which they had bribed a Digger Indian to show them. After their guide had taken their money, he went off to the sheriff, and, receiving another bribe, informed him where they were hiding. A fire was kindled at the mouth of the cave, and the poor fellows, fairly trapped, had to crawl out one by one, and to pay their money without loss of time. They never think of the wretched economy of all this, and of the loss of time being more than all the tax amounts to, but only of the sum which has to be squeezed out of their hoard. Yet John is not such a bad fellow, even when from home. Though rarely mingling in general society, yet on high occasions he is most hospitable. Once a year in southern Oregon the Chinese give a grand dinner, to which they invite the neighboring storekeepers and other friends. These storekeepers almost live by the Chinese, as there are no native dealers there. It is amusing to see the stock in trade of one of these "cute Yankees," who is possibly a pillar of the church: Chinese gods, papers to burn in the temple of Joss, Chinese swanpans, almanacs, novels, medicines, pickled cabbage, slugs, &c., possibly the whole superintended by a Chinese clerk. These entertainments were, however, greatly eclipsed by the grand dinner they gave to Mr. Burlingame, at present Chief Ambassador to the Treaty Powers, on his way out to China as United States Ambassador, and some time previously to Mr. Colfax, the Speaker of Congress, on the occasion of his visit to San Francisco in 1865. It was given by the 5 great hongs or mercantile companies of San Francisco, and was quite unique in its way, Chinese dishes and European being both presented. Of the former I counted some 165, but there must have been many more. They included every possible delicacy: shark's fins, bird nest soup, young bamboo, scorpion's eggs, and so forth, and so forth, and so forth, eaten with chopsticks, with dessert about the beginning of the feast, including tea, which is said to have cost $50 per pound. Between the courses the hosts and guests left the table and were entertained by a Chinese opera, consisting of a 1-stringed fiddle, a sort of gong, and something looking like a mud turtle, on the back of which they beat. They are exceedingly industrious, and if a Chinaman makes only half $1 a day, he will save half of it. If he is well off, he lives well, but still saves. At their New Year, in February, all accounts must be settled up, otherwise good reasons must be shown why he should continue in business or hold further commercial dealings. Most of them speak a sort of broken English, known in Canton as Pidgin English, and all are exceedingly anxious to learn. Still, notwithstanding all their industry, they will occasionally come to grief and land within the interior of the Californian White Cross Prison. A Chinese named Ah Sam, who kept the Lord Nelson restaurant in Victoria, Vancouver Island, became bankrupt and was ordered to file a schedule of his assets. Not knowing the names of his customers, he had entered a short description of them in his ledger, and when he entered court he had nothing more than the following to show. It was given me by his solicitor as a legal curiosity: A butcher owes $18, captain of a schooner $50, cook in a ship galley $8, red shirt man $27, man comes late, a printer $10, cap man $8.50, lean man white man $20, fat Frenchman $30 62½, captain tall man $20, French old man $8, whiskers man $18 37½, blacksmith $49, barkeeper $5, workman $5, whiskers man's friends $6.25, double blanket man $6.50, little short man $10, double blanket man's friend $15, lame leg man $40, fat man $9.25, old workman $8, red whiskers $7.50, steamboat man $18, Indian ya $4 62½, Dick makes coal shoveler $28, yay yap earrings $25, flour pantaloon man $16, shoemaker gone to California $15 62½, a man, butcher's friend $39, stable man $16, get tight man $7. Footnote to tight, drunk. The last entry the Commissioner decided was of much too general a character to allow of the slightest hope of fixing the debt upon any one in particular. In San Francisco there are 5 great hongs, or merchant companies, called the Yang Wo, the Sees Yap, the Sam Yap, the Yan Wo, and Wing Yung companies. These companies have large wooden buildings in the town, where they not only carry on business, but lodge and board all the people attached to their companies when in the city. There are also benevolent associations to take care of the sick of their own people. There are no Chinese beggars in San Francisco, and that nation alone has no representatives in the public hospital. Most of the Chinese on the Pacific Coast come to California under contract to one or other of these companies, engaged at a low rate of wages, generally about $8 per month, and these companies again let out their labor in various ways. This is essentially the coolie system, and I think there need be little doubt but that this prevails in California. The laborers are said to be very faithful to their contracts. They have never yet learned to use the food of the people among whom they live. Rice is still the great staple, with sometimes a little pork, and on high occasions ducks and other fowls. He is not, however, at all particular in his commissariat. Rats, mice, and even their mortal enemy, the cat, is not safe from John's omnivorous stomach. I have often heard the miners venting curses, both loud and deep, on the prowling Chinese who had cleared the creek of cats. Their houses have a peculiar, faint, sickening odor, perfectly indescribable. A friend of mine used to declare that they smell of nothing but effete civilization. I have said so much about John's honesty that it may not be out of place to close this article with a few remarks upon the disreputable side of the Chinese character on the Pacific, albeit some have been of opinion that there is only one side, and that the shady one. It cannot but be expected, where thousands of men are continually arriving, but that some rogues will slip in, more especially when the laborers are recruited from the notoriously scoundrelly coolie population of Chinese cities. Some of them are most adroit fowl thieves, and will clear a fowl yard between sunset and sunrise. They rarely attempt burglary, and chiefly lay themselves out for the sneaking line. As they pass in single file along the street, with a basket on either end of a bamboo pole, loose, inconsiderate trifles are speedily transferred from shop doors to these receptacles, the thief marching on as innocently as possible. Some few years ago they put a considerable amount of base coin into circulation. They were also accused of sweating the coin, shaking it up in a bag for some hours, and then burning the bag to obtain the few grains which clung to the fibers of the cloth. They had a still more ingenious method of swindling, and that was to split open the $20 gold pieces, adroitly extract the inside, and then filling it with some metal of equal weight, close the two sides again. So neatly was this done that the union was not detected until some time after the trick had been in successful operation, and then only in the Mint at Philadelphia. They are notorious gamblers, and expend a large proportion of their earnings in this manner. In San Francisco and all the large towns there are regular gambling houses, and in the mining camps they spend a great portion of their leisure in playing, generally for pice or other low stakes. The keepers of these houses must be wealthy, as they invariably pay the large fines which are sometimes inflicted on them when detected infringing the act passed against gambling houses. They seem to have no idea of the binding nature of a legal oath, and accordingly their evidence is always received most cautiously. In the courts of law they are usually sworn by breaking a plate, cutting the neck of a fowl, or by burning a piece of paper before them. They do not intermarry with the whites, and few of the laborers bring wives with them. There are upwards of 1,500 of their women on the Pacific Coast, 1,000 of whom are in San Francisco, and nearly all of them are of the vilest class. The children are tolerably numerous in San Francisco, and are pretty little creatures, with their sparkling black eyes and queer little queues behind, eked out with green or scarlet silk. Suicides are very common among them, the Chinese seeming to care nothing for life. They are mostly Buddhists of a very corrupted type, though a few Christians are found among them. The former have a fine temple in San Francisco, and in every house is a little family temple or joss house, before which papers are burnt and offerings made at stated times. With the exception of gambling and opium smoking, they have few amusements. In San Francisco they support a curious little theatre, where the music is a demoniacal band of gongs, and the same play seemed to have been going on for several years when I last visited it, and is not yet finished. Kite flying is a favorite out-of-doors amusement. Chinese kites, made in the form of butterflies and birds, which give out a singing noise, are in great demand among the youth of the Pacific Coast. Occasionally, on a Sunday, a few of them will have an "out" on horseback or in a wagon. On these occasions some of them dress in European clothes, and the horsemanship and general display is a sight for gods and men. Except on the great festival of their New Year, you see very little dissipation among them. These holidays generally last 3 or 4 days, when all business is suspended, and you must wear foul linen until John, your washerman, has finished his jollification. The morning of the first day of the holidays is ushered in by a loud display of crackers and other fireworks, and before 9 o'clock the streets are covered with red papers. Sometimes, to the great delight of young California, a whole caskful is let off at once. A Chinese merchant told me that it generally costs about £1,000 each New Year for fireworks alone, and some houses in the city will expend from £60 to £80 for this item alone. During this season no allusion to anything sad, such as death, sickness, loss in business, or any misfortune, is tolerated by any one. Every sentiment must be of hope, good will, and good cheer. Every true subject of the Flowery Land does his best, and the attire of some of the wealthy Chinese far exceeds in cost the dresses of the richest of the whites. A sable cape, silk trousers, and embroidered silk jacket make a very expensive turnout. The greetings and salutations are very ceremonious, and all imaginary blessings are included in the interchange of good wishes. Upon almost all the stores, places of business, and tenements of the Chinese may be seen during the holiday season sundry strips of red paper pasted up, inscribed with Chinese characters. They are usually 5 in number, and are recognized in common parlance as charms, but among those familiar with the usages of these people as the 5 blessings. Each is inscribed with a separate blessing, such as health, wealth, friends, long life, and posterity. At this period they also visit the temple, observing certain religious rites, and making offerings of roast pigs and other dainties to their idols, which are afterwards withdrawn and eaten at their own feasts. The first 4 days at the beginning of each New Year are appropriated for the lower classes, and 30 days for the gentry, as a time of feasting in China, but on the Pacific Coast the custom is somewhat modified. Some of the wealthy Chinese keep up a round of festivities for 2 or 3 weeks, while the special holiday season may be said to expire at the end of 3 or 4 days. They have also other holidays in the course of the year. About these times indigestion and other ills trouble John, and the doctor has to be called in. There are many of these professional gentlemen on the Pacific Coast, grave-looking old fellows, but generally arrant rogues. Deer-horns, when in the velvet, are eagerly bought, being esteemed a valuable medicament by the Chinese. The gall of a bear is valued at its weight in gold, and the rare albino deer is equally prized. In 1864 there was quite a furore in San Francisco about a Chinese doctor whose consulting rooms were besieged by the elite of the city. His success was said to consist in careful regimen, his medicines being very harmless. He used, however, to ensure attention to diet and general conduct by laying down strict rules, to diverge from which, he informed his patients, would cause certain death to ensue from the medicine. He was of a fine appearance, richly dressed, and spoke through an Englishman as an interpreter. His lionization lasted a few weeks, and after that he gradually dropped into oblivion, to make way for some other sensation. On the whole, the rapidly increasing Chinese population is an advantage to the American States and Territories on the Pacific, as well as the British colonies further north. They cultivate ground which no one else will, and work gold mines disregarded by the whites. They are consumers to some extent of European and American manufactures, and whether or no their merchants pay taxes and import duties. On the whole, though kicked and abused, simply because they are harmless, inoffensive, and weak, and do not retaliate on the ruffians who maltreat them, as would anyone else, they are an industrious people who, if they do not become citizens, yet do not interfere in any way in politics, and in proportion to their numbers give less trouble to the law than anyone else, and are therefore deserving of every encouragement. End of Part 6. Part 7 of The American Far West, 7 Mid-Nineteenth Century Views from Abroad, by Anonymous. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 7, Far Western Miners. The Honest Miner. One autumn, a year or two ago, in pursuit of my travels, I struck into the wild mountain region of southern Oregon, just north of the California boundary line. I had not gone far on the trail before I overtook a stalwart, gray-shirted, knee-booted individual. He had a pack of scarlet blankets strapped on his back, and as he trudged along, for want of better company, he held an animated conversation with himself, an oath being most innocently introduced every now and then, when the merits of the case seemed to call for it. He was an old gold digger, returning to his favorite creek. He had been off on one of the usual digger wild goose chases, after some fancied El Dorado at a distance, but was returning, disappointed, to the place where he had mined for many a year. Every locality was familiar to him. As we walked together over the mountain, or by the banks of the creek or stream, down in the wooded valley, my companion would point out to me, with a half-regretful pride, the places where "big strikes" had been made in former times. Pointing to a ruined log cabin, out of the door of which a coyote wolf rushed, he assured me that the owner of that cabin had washed some $40,000 out of a patch 20 or 30 yards in extent. Was he a white man, I asked, for there are numbers of Chinese miners in that section of country. "Wal," was the reply, "not much. He war a Dutchman." In Pacific Coast parlance, it appeared, a white man did not altogether refer to the color of his face, but to the quality of his soul, and meant a good feller and a right sort of man, and that Dutchmen or Germans and the inhabitants of the north of Europe generally are not classed under that title. They are too saving, too steady, and possibly too clannish, for though he does become an American citizen as soon as he arrives, this is with no view to any political principles he entertains, but solely to facilitate the preemption of land and the acquisition of a lager beer brewery or the opening of a corner grocery. Canyon Creek, as the locality was named, had once, I was told, been a bully old diggin', but the stream having been pretty well washed out, the miners had decamped to parts unknown, leaving no address behind them. Like the Arabs, they folded their tents and silently moved away. Here was a half-ruined building, choked up with weeds, bearing record that it had once been the El Dorado Saloon, in other words, a gambling hell, or worse, and around it were a few cabins. This had been the town site, and the projectors, no doubt, imagined that it was to be the right smart chance of a city. However, fate had decided otherwise, and the only traces of former greatness to be seen were piles of stones and gravel, and long trenches, and half-ruined ditches, which gave the spot the appearance of a place where some great engineering operations had been left half finished. Here and there a solitary Chinese slunk about, intent on his own business, and, if my companion were to be believed, in pursuit of stray cats. As we turned a corner of the rough trail, we suddenly emerged in front of the store. By the door was sitting half a dozen of the old habitués of the creek, lazily talking. My friend was delighted. "There they are," he cried, "loafing about, chawin' baccy, just as natural as anythin'." He seemed to be a popular man among them. As his friend friendships are quickly made in the West I was received with vociferations of welcome, and the choice of half a dozen shanties to spread a blanket in. In this way I saw a good deal of the honest miner of Canyon Creek, and learned not a little of his ways of life and thought in this lonely little dell in the Californian mountains. Of course, we have all read about the miner in California, British Columbia, or Australia, about his extravagance, his boisterousness, and his conduct generally, and we are all too apt to think of him only as the roistering blade in the palmy days of 1849 or 1853, when gold could be had for the picking up. The typical miner in 1869 is a very different man from that of 1849, even though he be the same individual. No longer do you, as a rule, see the many fine-looking, handsome fellows in the early days of California 15 or 20 years ago. They were all young then, but hardship has told upon them, for in many cases they have pursued, with varying luck, that business of gold digging ever since. The 49ers are the blue blood of the coast, but they are proverbially poor. Accordingly, these men among whom I associated on Canyon Creek were very different from our usual notion of the gold miner, but were yet at the same time very characteristic types of what is well known on the Rocky Mountain slopes as the honest miner. He is a peculiar individual, and differs in many respects from the settler of late years. Enter his cabin, and there is always indubitable evidence of a miserable life of single blessedness. The gold digger is almost universally unmarried. The rough blanket-spread cot, the axe-hewn table with its scanty array of crockery, the old battered stove or fireplace built of clay and stones, the inevitable sack of flour, half sack of potatoes, and junk of pork. The old clothes and old boots, and a few books and newspapers, go far in making out the extent of the miner's worldly possessions. A little patch of cultivated ground enclosed by old sluice-box lumber is sometimes an accompaniment, as well as a dog, a cat, or a few fowls. The inhabitant of this cabin is often rough, gray, and grizzly. He came out 20 years ago, and his residence has, with few exceptions, always been on the gulch where we now find him. Probably it rejoices in the euphonious name of Horse Beef Bar, Bulldog Point, Jackass Gulch, or Groundhog's Glory. By these names it may or may not be found on the Surveyor General's map, but at all events it goes by no other. He does his trading at a store at Diggerburg. Credit he calls Jawbone, and talks about running his face for grub, but sometimes this is objected to by the storekeeper, as the gulch is not paying well, and behind the counter you may see a mule's jawbone significantly suspended, and below the words "played out." Here the honest miner purchases a few pounds of flour, a little tea, coffee, and brown sugar, and as much as he can buy of whiskey. He can tell where all the rich spots have been in the rivers, bars, gulches, and flats, but that was in the glorious, wicked, cutting, shouting, fortune-making times of yore. He can't tell where there are any rich spots now. He is certain there is a rich quartz ledge in the mountain yonder, and if he could get water on the flat he is sure it would pay good wages. Excess of fortune spoiled him in '49. Economy is a myth with him, and he cheerfully entertains half a dozen friends, though his magazine of provisions, as well as of money, be in an advanced state of exhaustion. His supper cooked, he thinks of home, that is, the home of 20 years ago. In reality he has no home. Mentally he sees the faces of his youth, fresh and blooming, but they are getting old and withered now. He sees the peach orchard and the farmhouse from which he wandered, a young rover, when first the news of golden California burst upon the astonished ears of the world. That home is now in the hands of strangers. Were he to go East, as he calls it, he would find himself a stranger in a strange land. He thinks he'll go back some time or other. Fortune occasionally favors him a trifle more than usual, and then he may make a trip up to the Bay, as he calls San Francisco. He stops at the What Cheer House. He may be seen there by hundreds. Poor fellow! He came here to enjoy himself, but he doesn't well know how. The novelty of the city wears off in a day or two. Without occupation, his routine of life broken, he becomes a victim to a disease for which the French could alone have invented a name: ennui. At night he can go to the theatre, but by day he sits in rows in the hall of the hotel, crowds the entrance, and sometimes blocks up the street. If he have money enough, and be so inclined, he may go on the spludge, and possibly get drunk, but that, with this class of miner, is not very likely. His face wears an expression of wild bewilderment and intense weariness. Unaccustomed to the hurry and bustle of the city, he collides frequently with the denizens of the metropolis. The spruce, fashionably dressed, frizzle-headed clerks who flit by excite in him feelings of contempt and indignation. The swarms of youthful females in the streets astonish, delight, and tantalize him. It is something so new to him. There are few on Jackass Gulch, and they would be better away. When he knew Frisco, it was not much more than a collection of cotton tents on some sand hills. Now it is a fine city of 150,000 inhabitants. Females were almost unknown, and the announcement by a steamboat proprietor of 4 lady passengers to-night was quite enough to ensure a crowded patronage for his vessel. But the digger of the auriferous soil often leaves the city with the knowledge that the world has gone far ahead of him during his lonely residence in the mountains. He had far better not have come. In Diggerburg he is somebody. In San Francisco he is lost among the crowd, or at best is only a rusty old miner, those who thus contemptuously talk of him forgetting that he and such as he were the founders, and are yet to a great extent the stronghold of California. I fancy I do not really wrong the honest miner in saying he does not possess much religion. Yet if a clergyman by any chance come into his camp, he makes a point of attending meeting, on much the same principle, and with feelings of about equal reverence, with which he would go to a dog fight or a tight-rope performance, because he looks upon it as the right thing to patronize the affair. If the parson look on as he is washing for gold, he will ask him if he would like to wash out a pan, and as this invitation is usually accepted, the worthy fellow will contrive to slip in among the gravel a tolerable nugget, so that the washer may be nothing the worse for his clerical visit, custom in such cases providing that the contents of the pan go to the visitor. At one time there was a revival of religion among the miners. Never was there such a demand for tracts. Indeed, so great was the demand that a special appeal had to be issued by a certain religious body, whose mission it was to look after such matters, for increased contributions to the dear Gold Diggers' Tract Fund. To use the words of the appeal, "The cry comes o'er the western wave, more tracts, more tracts." At last the painful truth oozed out, though I hardly think it was related at the May meetings, that the miners used the tracts to paper their log shanties. A friend of mine, whose lot it was to officiate as a clergyman among them at one time, used often to tell me that he had to ring a bell in the morning all through the Apology for a Street, inviting his parishioners to divine worship, and that, finding nobody in church when he came in, he first looked into one gambling saloon or tavern, and then into another, inviting those assembled there to come to church. "All right, parson," would be the good-natured reply. "We'll go there as soon as we've played out this hand for the whiskies. Jest be goin' ahead with the prayers and things, and we'll be along for the preachin'." This taking of drinks is characteristic of the miner. No bargain can be made, or any other matter of business or sociality settled, without the indispensable drinks. The same clerical friend, whose experience I have just related, was shocked on his first arrival among the miners at being asked to stand drinks after he had received a very liberal subscription towards the building of his church. Two mining companies that I know something about threw dice to determine which of them should treat the whole creek to champagne, and as that wine was sold at $15 per bottle, the cost to the loser may be guessed. In most mining localities it is looked upon as a cause of mortal offense to decline drinking with the first fellow who shouts, "Let's put in a blast, Colonel." In some places it is quite a serious breach of etiquette not to ask all who are sitting round in the bar room of a tavern, though total strangers, to "step up and take a drink." Sometimes they do not require any invitation. A friend of mine, having had a long ride one day, dismounted at a tavern to take, more Americano, some refreshment, when, to his utter astonishment, 14 men who were sitting around stepped up and "'lowed they would take sugar in larn." He paid for the 15 drinks, as it was in strict accordance with the custom of the country, but he took care not to go back to that hostelry again. The Australian gold digger is in many respects different from the Californian, but still he evinces the same carelessness of money. It used to be the custom for these men to come down to some village after they had made a slight pile, go each to his favorite public house, and give the money into the landlord's hand, with the information that he shouted, or asked all and sundry to drink, until it was finished. Then the landlord, at intervals, would say, "Step up, boys, it's Jim Jenkins' shout." Then they all wished Jim luck, until Jim's shout was out, and then he went back to his gully, proud that he had "spent his money like a man." On one occasion a miner came down and handed his money over to the landlord, but, contrary to expectation, nobody would respond to his shout. He had been a convict, and lagged for some grievous offence. The man was at his wits' end. At last he struck upon the brilliant expedient of engaging an idler at labourer's daily wages, 8 shillings, to drink with him. And so he got through his holiday. No one can tell where a rich mine will be discovered, or where it will not. Even quartz mines, which require skill to diagnose, have been equally discovered by chance. A robber fired at a man standing with his back to a rock, but missed. As the ball splintered the moss-grown quartz, the miner who was attacked saw specks of gold sparkle in the moonlight. It afterwards proved one of the richest mines in California. Two miners about to leave the country just to celebrate the event got "on the spudge" the night before their intended departure. As they were coming home to their cabins, in mere foolishness they commenced rolling stones down a slope. One of these struck off the point of a rock, which, on being examined, was found rich with specks of gold. This changed their plans, and they stayed to some purpose, for they afterwards became very wealthy men. The honest miner is far from being what may be called a domestic character. If he were making $5 per diem to the hand at Greaser's Camp, and heard that somebody was making 6 at Hellgate Canyon in Mountain Goat Gulch, the chances are that he would presently disappear to the new El Dorado. Now, Gold Bluff was the point to which all were rushing. That failed, but it didn't dishearten the men. They next rushed in thousands to Gold Lake, and then the cry was Fraser River, which disappointed so many thousands that eventually it became a matter of as serious personal offense to ask a gentleman if he had been to Fraser River as to tell him to go to Jericho. In 1863 the infuriated miner was blocking all the mountain trails, and Washoe was the cry. In 1864 it was Blackfoot. In 1866 I saw hundreds rushing through slush and snow for Big Bend, in the heart of the Rocky Mountains, declaring that Caribou wasn't a patch on it, and that at all events they would see the elephant. It is curious that men who have been on the Pacific coast since the commencement of gold mining, who have knocked about the Rocky Mountain slopes and have been the victims of a dozen disappointments, should be so easily tempted again to risk fortune. But it is so, and the country would never have been what it is if they had all been as sensible as they might have been. This vagabond propensity will fasten on a man who allows himself to sit in front of a frying pan and a bundle of blankets on the ridgepole of a sore-backed horse, and I verily believe there are many men who, if their history were known, have traveled more and endured greater hardship in this way than many whose names are famous in the annals of travel, and whom the Geographical Society delights to honor. The true seeker after El Dorado does not stop at distance or difficulties. The Pacific Coast gold miner does not care to be called, like the Australian, a digger, the term in the former region being applied to and associated with a miserable race of Indians who inhabit the mountains. He likes to be called by the title I have put at the head of this paper, the honest miner. That he is honest enough, as honesty goes in America, nobody will deny to the profession as a whole, but still there is occasionally the dishonest miner. We do not speak of the rascal who is caught stealing gold out of the sluice box and gets lynched for his pains, but of the equally rascally individual who salts a claim before selling it. That is, he scatters a few pieces through the gravel before the buyer comes to test it. In California some of the claims are wrought summer and winter. Indeed, the winter is more favorable than the summer, because water is more plentiful. But in British Columbia and in the Rocky Mountains, the frost causes working to be suspended. Then the claims are laid over, and the great body of the miners come down to Victoria and other towns to pass the winter months and to spend the money they have made during the summer. They also try to dispose of rather doubtful claims at this time, and one of the means adopted is to report having struck a good prospect just before leaving. It is remarkable, to say the least of it, how many good prospects are struck in this way. The endless swindles connected with quartz companies are, I dare say, vividly enough in the memory of certain gentlemen in the city of London and elsewhere, whose purses were longer than their foresight. Gold mining will always be a staple industry in the Rocky Mountain slope, and the increased immigration and attention excited by the Pacific Railroad will greatly increase the business. But the old miner will be killed off. Large companies will work his claims, and shoals of new hands will crowd his solitary valleys, men who know not the old traditions and have no sympathy with the old manners. He himself will meet them half-way, and will unconsciously lose many of his characteristics and peculiarities. He will get toned down to the duller routine of other workmen, as his pursuit takes its place among the industries. End of Part 7. End of The American Far West, 7 Mid-Nineteenth Century Views from Abroad, by Anonymous.